The town is small even by the standards of its own county. Fewer than 300 people, a cotton gin, 2 churches, a schoolhouse, a general store where men gather on the porch to talk about rainfall and the price of seed. It is a town that has been dying quietly for 3 years. The cotton crop failed, then it failed again. A boll weevil infestation moved north out of Mexico and ate through the fields like a slow fire. And then, in the winter, spotted fever came through and took children out of half the families in town and left the survivors with a kind of exhaustion that never quite lifted. The railroad, which had been surveyed to run straight through the centre of Aurora, was rerouted several miles south instead, and with it went any future the town might have had. So on the morning of April 17th, Aurora is a place where very little happens, and where the people have grown accustomed to very little happening. The sun has not fully risen. The eastern sky is the colour of a bruise turning yellow at the edges. There is dew on the grass and a thin white mist lying in the low places between the fields. Judge J.S. Proctor is awake early, as he always is. He's a man of routine, coffee, the porch, the slow inventory of the day's work in his head before his hands begin any of it. And then he hears something. Not thunder. Thunder rolls. This does not roll. It arrives all at once and stays. Not a train. A train has rhythm, a beat you can count. This has no beat. It is a low metallic vibration, deep enough that he feels it in the boards of the porch and in the small bones behind his ears. It does not echo. That is the detail he will repeat for the rest of his life to anyone who asks. Sound in open country echoes. It bounces off the tree line, off the barn, off the flat face of the earth itself. This sound does not come back. It simply sits in the air everywhere at once, as though the sky itself has begun to hum. Doors open along the road. Neighbours step out onto their porches and shirt sleeves, squinting east, coffee going cold in their hands. Someone's dog begins to bark and then stops abruptly mid-sound and lies down flat in the dirt with its ears against its skull. And then they see it. It comes out of the low mist to the northeast, moving so slowly that the mind refuses at first to accept it as a moving object at all. It seems more like a cloud that has decided to hold a shape. It is long, cigar-shaped, the newspapers will say later, and that word will follow it through a century of retellings. Perhaps 100 feet from end to end, though nobody thinks to measure and nobody could have. Its surface catches the early light in a way that is difficult to describe, because it is not the flash of polished metal, and it is not the dullness of iron. It is something in between, a grey that seems to hold light rather than reflect it. It is damaged. Even from the ground, even to farmers who have never in their lives seen a flying machine of any kind, this much is obvious. Something along its underside is torn open. A section of the hull hangs loose and trails behind it, turning slowly on some invisible tether. There is a fine mist streaming from the wound, silver-coloured, dissipating in the cold air like breath, and it is far too slow to be staying up. That is the thing they will all say afterward, every one of them, in their own words. It was going too slow. A thrown stone falls. A dropped hat falls. This thing is moving at the pace of a walking horse, drifting at the height of the treetops, and it is not falling, and it is not rising, and every instinct in every person watching says that this is not possible. It crosses the public square. It passes over the northern fence line of Judge Proctor's property, and then it begins to come down. Not a plunge, not a dive, a long tired settling, like an animal lowering itself onto its side. There is a windmill on the Proctor place, a tall wooden lattice tower with an iron wheel at the top, the kind that stood over half the farms in Texas in that decade, pumping well water into a stock tank for cattle. The object strikes it dead centre. The sound is wrong. Everyone agrees on that afterward. It is wrong. There is a crack of splintering timber, which is expected, and there is the shriek of metal folding, which is expected, and then there is a third sound underneath both of them that nobody can name, a sound like a struck bell heard through water, a single deep tone that seems to come from inside the listeners rather than from the field, and then the light. Not fire. Fire is orange and red, and it climbs and it smokes and it takes time. This is not fire. This is a flash of white so pure and so total that men standing 400 yards away will describe seeing the shadows of their own bones through their closed eyelids. It fills the field. It fills the sky above the field. For perhaps a second and a half, the entire eastern half of Aurora, Texas, is brighter than noon. And then it is gone, and the dawn returns, and the field is scattered with debris, and the windmill is a broken skeleton, and Judge Proctor's flower garden, which his late wife planted and which he has tended every spring since her death, is completely destroyed. There is almost no smoke. That is the second detail that will haunt the witnesses. An explosion of that violence should have left a burning field and a black column climbing into the morning. Instead, there is a faint smell in the air, sharp and mineral, like the smell of the air just before lightning strikes, and there are pieces of something scattered across 2 acres, and there is silence. The first men to reach the wreckage arrive within 4 or 5 minutes, running across the field with their suspenders half up, expecting to find a boiler explosion or a burst gas envelope or the wreck of some rich man's experimental machine. They stop about 30 feet short. They do not speak. They stand in a loose semicircle in the ruined flower garden in the grey morning light, staring at the largest surviving section of the hull and at the place where the torn seam has opened it like a shell, because something has survived the crash, and it is not one of them. To understand why Aurora matters, you have to understand what was happening in the American sky in the 18 months before that morning. Because Aurora was not the first. In November of 1896, people in Sacramento, California, began reporting a light moving slowly over the city at night. Not a star, not a lantern, a light that travelled against the wind, paused, changed direction, and moved on. Hundreds of people saw it over several nights. Some described a dark shape behind the light. Some described hearing voices coming down from it, faintly, as though men were calling to one another somewhere above the rooftops. The newspapers called it the mystery airship, and then it spread. Through the winter and into the spring of 1897, reports moved east across the United States like weather. San Francisco, then Nebraska, then Kansas, then Iowa, Michigan, Illinois, Missouri, Arkansas, and finally Texas. Thousands of sightings, tens of thousands of witnesses, farmers, sheriffs, judges, ministers, railroad engineers, school teachers, telegraph operators, sober people with reputations to protect, describing the same handful of things over and over again. A long dark hull, usually cigar-shaped or egg-shaped, a brilliant searchlight sweeping the ground, motion that was almost entirely silent, turns and stops and reversals that no balloon in the world could perform, and occupants, sometimes shadows moving behind windows, sometimes figures leaning over a railing, sometimes voices. Now. Here is the fact that most people skip past, and it is the fact that makes all of this strange. There were no airplanes, none, not one, anywhere on Earth. The Wright brothers would not fly at Kitty Hawk for another 6 years and 7 months. Powered, controlled, heavier than air flight did not exist. It was not a mature technology being kept quiet. It was not a prototype in a shed somewhere. It simply had not been achieved by any human being on the planet. Dirigibles existed in a primitive form, but the airships of 1897 were slow, fragile, enormously expensive, extremely rare, and completely incapable of the flights being described. No dirigible in the world in that year could cross a continent. No dirigible could hold a position against a headwind. No dirigible could appear over Kansas on a Tuesday and Michigan on a Thursday. And yet the reports came anyway, week after week, from hundreds of towns that had no way of coordinating with one another and no reason to. Historians have offered explanations, and some of them are good. Newspapers in that era were fiercely competitive and not especially concerned with accuracy. A colourful story sold. Papers and a colourful story that could be attributed to an anonymous farmer sold papers without much risk. Editors openly invented material. Some of the airship stories were unquestionably fabricated, and a few of the fabricators later admitted it. One Kansas rancher named Alexander Hamilton famously described an airship lassoing and stealing one of his cows, a story that was accompanied by sworn affidavits from local dignitaries, and which turned out decades later to have been a lie manufactured by a small-town liars club as a joke on the national press. There was also the planet Venus, which was unusually bright in the western sky that spring, and which accounted for an enormous number of slow-moving lights over an enormous number of American towns. So yes, much of the airship wave was noise, but not all of it, and the fragments that remain after you subtract the hoaxes and the misidentifications and the newspaper inventions are strange in a way that does not resolve. They cluster. They follow a rough geographic progression, and they describe again and again a machine that was doing things that no machine on Earth could do. That is the conventional history. Fascinating, unresolved, filed away as a curiosity of the late 19th century. According to the conspiracy, it was something else entirely. According to the conspiracy, the airship wave of 1896 and 1897 was not a wave of sightings at all. It was a survey, a systematic, methodical, low-altitude reconnaissance of the North American interior conducted over roughly 18 months, following a grid pattern that only becomes visible when you plot the credible sightings on a map and ignore the ones that are obviously invented. The searchlights were not searchlights, they were instruments. The slow speed was not a limitation, it was a requirement. You cannot map terrain in detail at high velocity, and the reason the sightings were so open, so brazen, so frequently made over populated towns in broad daylight was that whatever was conducting the survey did not consider human observation to be a meaningful risk, which, in 1897, was a reasonable assessment, until the 17th of April, until one of them came down. 2 days after the crash, on the 19th of April 1897, the Dallas Morning News published a short article filed by its Aurora correspondent, a man named S.E. Hayden. It is not a long piece, a few hundred words. It ran on an inside page surrounded by advertisements and county news, the kind of item a reader would glance at over breakfast and forget by lunch. But it is, without exaggeration, one of the strangest documents in American journalism, and it is entirely real. You can find it today in newspaper archives. You can read it yourself in about 90 seconds. The article says that at about 6 o'clock in the morning, the early risers of Aurora saw an airship sailing over the public square. It says the craft had been seen elsewhere in the north of the state and had been travelling at great speed, but that as it neared Aurora it appeared to be having trouble, moving only about 10 or 12 miles an hour and gradually settling toward the earth. It says the ship sailed over the square and collided with the tower of Judge Proctor's windmill, and that the resulting explosion scattered debris over several acres of ground, wrecking the windmill and water tank and destroying the judge's flower garden. And then the article says the thing that turned a local accident into a permanent mystery. It says the pilot of the ship was found, and that he was badly disfigured, but that enough of him remained to show that he was not an inhabitant of this world. The article attributes this assessment to a man identified as T.J. Weems, described as a United States Signal Service officer and an authority on astronomy, who gave it as his opinion that the pilot was a native of the planet Mars. The article says papers were found on the body, written in unknown hieroglyphics, which could not be deciphered. It says the wreckage was made of an unknown metal, resembling a mixture of aluminum and silver, and that it must have weighed several tons, and it says, in its final line, that the pilot's remains were to be given a Christian burial in the Aurora Cemetery the following day. That is the whole of it. No follow-up, no investigation, no national outcry. The story ran, and the country turned the page, and within a few weeks the airship wave itself collapsed and the newspapers moved on to other things. Aurora went back to dying quietly, and that is where the historical record leaves it. The sceptical reading is straightforward and, honestly, quite strong. Aurora was a town in freefall. It had lost its crops, lost its railroad, lost a portion of its children to fever. Some researchers have suggested that Hayden wrote the piece as a deliberate hoax, a last desperate attempt to put Aurora on the map and draw travellers off the road. Records suggest that T.J. Weems was not a signal service officer at all, but the town blacksmith. Judge Proctor, some later accounts claim, did not even have a windmill on his property, though this point has been disputed by people who lived there. It is a good explanation. Tidy, human, sad in its way. But here is where the other version begins, because in the version we are following tonight, a modern investigative journalist named Rebecca Hayes sat down with that article a very long time later, and she did something that almost nobody had bothered to do in a century. She did not try to prove the crash. She tried to trace the people. Hayes was in her early 40s, a features writer who had spent most of her career on municipal corruption and water rights, which is to say she had spent most of her career reading old documents in county basements and noticing when the paperwork did not add up. She came to Aurora on an assignment she did not particularly want, expecting to file 800 words of gentle small-town colour for a Sunday supplement. She started with a simple question. Who were these people, and what happened to them? The article named names: Judge Proctor, T.J. Weems, Hayden himself. The article referred to townspeople, to early risers, to the men who gathered the wreckage and dug the grave. In a town of under 300, that is not an anonymous crowd. Those are identifiable individuals, and in 1897, identifiable individuals left paper behind. Census entries, land deeds, marriage licenses, church rolls, tax assessments, death certificates. So Hayes went looking for the paper, and what she found was not a story about aliens, it was a story about absence. Several of the names connected to the incident appear normally in the census of 1890, in property records, in church membership rolls, in the ordinary sediment of a life lived in one place. They buy land, they marry, they serve on juries, they appear over and over in the small documentation of a small town. And then, within about 4 years of April 1897, they stop. Not all at once, not dramatically. They simply thin out and disappear. One family's land changes hands in 1899, sold to a buyer whose name appears nowhere else in the county's records, before or after, in any capacity. Another parcel is transferred in 1900 to an entity listed only as a land and improvement company, with an address in Fort Worth, an address that in the city directories of that year corresponds to a building that housed no such business. Death certificates for several of the individuals cannot be located. Not lost, Hayes noted carefully in her file, because plenty of records from that period are genuinely lost. Something narrower than that. For most of the people who died in Wise County in those years, there is at least a fragment somewhere. A church burial record, a probate filing, a newspaper notice, a headstone. For these particular names there is a consistent, patterned nothing. And one more thing, which Hayes found almost by accident while looking for something else. In the 1890 census, the population of Aurora is listed at a certain figure. In the census of 1900, it is dramatically lower, which is entirely expected in a town abandoned after crop failure and fever. But the enumerator's field notes for the 1900 count, which survive in a state archive, contain a marginal annotation in a different hand from the rest of the document. It reads, "Subject households absent, forwarding unavailable, per instruction." Per instruction. A federal census enumerator in 1900, walking a dirt road in Wise County, Texas, was operating under an instruction regarding specific households. Hayes photographed that page 4 times, from 4 angles, and sent copies to 2 separate email. addresses before she left the building. It was the first moment, she would say later, that she stopped writing a feature story and started writing something else. The Aurora Cemetery is still there. It sits at the end of a short gravel road on the north side of town, a rectangle of ground perhaps 2 acres across, bordered by a wire fence and a row of old cedars. It is still in use. Families still bury their dead there. In the newer sections you will find polished granite and plastic flowers and the names of people who died within living memory. But in the old section, near the western fence, there is a place that has been the subject of a genuine, documented, legally contested argument. For most of the 20th century there was a small rough stone there, not a proper headstone, a field rock roughly the size of a loaf of bread, with something scratched into its face by hand. Photographs taken before 1973 show what appears to be a crude carving of a long shape, with 3 circles or ports along its side, a cigar shape. Local families said, in the way that small towns say things, that the stone marked the grave of the airship pilot, not with any great conviction, and not always without laughing. It was the sort of thing you told a visiting nephew, the sort of thing that came out on porches in summer. Then, in 1973, the story briefly came back to life. That year, a reporter for the Dallas Times-Herald named Bill Case became seriously interested in the Aurora incident and began publishing a series of articles about it. Investigators from a civilian research organisation arrived with metal detectors and began sweeping the cemetery and the surrounding fields, and they found something. Around the unmarked grave, and only around it, the detectors registered strong readings. Fragments were recovered from the soil. Some of the material was sent for laboratory analysis. The results, when they came back, were ambiguous in a way that satisfied absolutely nobody. Most of what was tested proved to be ordinary aluminum and iron of no particular interest. A small portion of one sample was reported as unusual in its composition, and that report has been argued about ever since, by people on both sides, with more heat than the evidence probably justifies. The researchers then asked for permission to exhume the grave, and this is where the story stops being folklore and becomes documented legal history. The Aurora Cemetery Association refused. The researchers pressed. The association went to court and obtained a restraining order preventing any excavation of the site. The grave was never opened. Not long afterward, the rough stone with the carving on it disappeared. It was simply gone one day. It has never been recovered. Nobody knows who took it, or when, or why, and the family names most closely associated with the cemetery have said only that they do not know. And then, in the years that followed, several iron pipes were driven into the ground at that spot. Cemetery officials have explained this as a marker, a way of locating the site. Others have noted that a set of iron pipes driven into and around a grave is an extraordinarily effective way to make that grave permanently unreadable to a metal detector. Today there is a Texas historical marker at the cemetery gate. It mentions the legend of the spaceman in plain language, in the flat, neutral voice of state historical commissions everywhere, treating it as a piece of local colour. That is all true. All of it. You can look up the court records. You can drive out there and read the marker yourself. Here is where the conspiracy takes hold of it. Rebecca Hayes did not think the Cemetery Association was hiding a body. She thought they were hiding the absence of one. Consider it from the inside, she wrote in her notes. Consider that you are a member of a family that has been in this town for 4 generations, and that somewhere in your grandmother's stories there is a piece of information you have never repeated to an outsider, which is that at some point long ago, on a night nobody wrote down, men came to the cemetery with lanterns and a wagon, and in the morning the ground by the western fence was disturbed, and afterward nobody in the family ever spoke about that grave in a serious voice again. If that is what you inherited, then your position in 1973 is very simple and very difficult. You cannot allow that grave to be opened, not because of what is in it, because of what is not. An empty grave is not a mystery that quietly persists for another century. An empty grave is a headline. An empty grave brings federal attention to a town of 40 people. An empty grave means that everything your family has spent 70 years pretending was a joke turns out to have been true, and that whoever emptied it is presumably still capable of noticing that you noticed. So you hire a lawyer, you get an injunction, you're polite and immovable, you let the researchers keep their soil samples and their ambiguous laboratory reports, because ambiguity is survivable and certainty is not. And at some point, quietly, someone in your family walks out to the western fence at dusk and takes away the stone with the carving on it, because the stone is the only physical thing that ever tied the story to that exact patch of earth. Hayes could not prove a word of this. She was scrupulous about that in her own files. She wrote it out as a scenario, labelled it as a scenario, and left it alone for almost a year. Then she found the diary. It came to her the way these things almost always come, which is to say by accident, through a person who did not understand what they had. A woman in her 70s, living outside Decatur, contacted Hayes after reading a piece she had published about the census records. The woman's late husband had been the grandson of Aurora's blacksmith. When the husband died, she had cleared out a storage unit and found, among tax returns and fishing gear and a box of unlabelled photographs, a small cloth-bound journal with a cracked spine. She had not read most of it. The handwriting was difficult and she had never been much for old things. But she had read enough to be unsettled, and she had held on to it for 11 years without knowing why. The journal was not written in 1897. That is important. It was written in the 1930s by a man in his 60s, recording what his father had told him about a morning in his childhood. It is a second-hand account written down 40 years after it was heard, and Hayes was clear-eyed about exactly how much weight that can bear. But it is specific in ways that inventions usually are not. It describes the sound, not as a boom, but as a bell heard underwater, and it notes that the writer's father could never hear a struck bell afterward, without his stomach turning over. It describes the light, and it uses the same detail that appears nowhere in the newspaper article, that men saw the shapes of their own hand bones through their eyelids. It describes the smell of the field, sharp, mineral, like the air before lightning, and then it describes the man. According to the journal, everyone in Aurora assumed that the response to the crash came from the county, and then from the state, and then eventually from the federal government, in that order, over a period of days. That is how things worked. Word travelled by telegraph if you were lucky and by horse if you were not. Wise County was not close to anything, but the journal says that was not what happened. The journal says that the first outside authority to arrive in Aurora reached the Proctor property before noon on the day of the crash. One man, alone, on horseback, coming up the road from the south, unhurried. He was not in uniform. He carried no visible weapon. He wore a dark coat, unremarkable for the period, and a hat, and he was described as being somewhere between 35 and 50 years old, which in the journal's phrasing means that nobody could later agree on his age at all. He didn't introduce himself. He did not present a badge, a commission, a letter of authority, a telegram, or any document of any kind. He rode up to the ruined flower garden where perhaps 40 people were standing around the wreckage, and he dismounted, and he looked at it for a long moment. And then he began giving instructions, and here is the part that the writer's father apparently could never explain, and that troubled him for the rest of his life. Everyone obeyed, not reluctantly, not after argument. Judge Proctor, a man who had presided over disputes in that county for 2 decades, and who was standing in the wreckage of his own dead wife's garden, took direction from an unidentified stranger without asking his name. The town constable did the same. The men who had gathered up fragments and put them in a wheelbarrow were told to put the wheelbarrow down, and they put it down. The journal says the stranger spoke quietly and slowly, and never repeated himself. It says he addressed several men by name, names he had not been told. By the end of that afternoon, the wreckage had been consolidated into a single pile and covered with tarpaulins. The body had been moved into the barn. Nobody was permitted onto the field without the stranger's presence, and a rider had been sent at the stranger's direction. not to the county seat at Decatur, but to a specific address in Fort Worth, carrying a sealed message that the rider was instructed not to open, deliver to anyone else, or discuss. The journal notes that this rider was a 19-year-old named Elias, and that Elias did not come back. His horse came back 4 days later, unsaddled, in good condition, well fed. Elias did not. Hayes cross-referenced the name against the census. There is an Elias of the right age in the 1890 count in Aurora, in a household with 2 parents and 3 siblings. He does not appear anywhere in 1900. Neither does the household. The Dallas Morning News article mentioned papers found on the body covered in unknown hieroglyphics. The journal describes something different, and in a way more interesting. Not paper, metal. According to the account, scattered through the debris field were thin sheets of the hull material, some no larger than a playing card, and their inner surfaces were covered in tiny engraved marks. The marks were extremely small. The journal's writer says his father described needing to hold a fragment at arm's length in bright sun to see that there was anything on it at all, and then needing a magnifying lens to see what. They were not decorative. Everyone who looked at them agreed on that. Decoration repeats. Decoration has rhythm and symmetry, and it fills space evenly, because that is what decoration is for. These marks did none of that. They ran in dense, unbroken lines, tight and even, without borders or flourishes or empty space, packed edge to edge like text set by a machine. The men of Aurora, being sensible men, concluded that it was writing in a foreign language. The stranger, according to the journal, looked at one fragment for approximately 4 seconds, and then put it face down on the tarpaulin and did not look at it again. Before the material was taken away, at least 3 people made sketches. 2 of those sketches survived into the 1930s inside the journal, copied by hand and imperfectly, and reproduced from memory. Hayes was appropriately cautious about this. A hand copy of a glimpse is not evidence of anything. But she photographed them, and she started showing them to people. Most of the people she showed them to said the obvious thing, which was that they looked like a made-up alphabet, and that people have been inventing alien alphabets for as long as there have been alien stories, and that these were not especially imaginative ones. Then she showed them to a retired professor of electrical engineering, a man in his 80s who had spent his career on antenna theory, and who agreed to look at them mostly to be polite to a journalist who had driven 3 hours. He put on his glasses. He looked at the pages for a long time without saying anything. Then he asked her where she had gotten diagrams of impedance matching networks. Hayes did not know what that meant. He explained it to her twice, and the second time she understood it well enough to write it down. The marks, he said, were not letters. Letters are arbitrary. A letter has no relationship to the sound it represents beyond agreement. That is the entire point of an alphabet. These marks were not arbitrary. They were structured. Certain shapes appeared only in fixed relationships to certain other shapes. Some symbols never appeared alone. Some appeared always as pairs bracketing a third. And the sequences were not distributed the way language is distributed. Human writing has an enormous amount of redundancy in it, because human beings are noisy and need to be understood over noise. This had almost none. What it had instead, he said, was the structure of notation, the way a chemical formula is notation, the way a circuit diagram is notation, the way sheet music is notation. A system where the symbol does not stand for a sound, it stands for a value or a relationship or an operation, and where the arrangement on the page is itself part of the meaning. He could not read them. He was very clear about that. He said that reading them would require knowing what quantities were being described, and there was no way to know that from a hand-copied sketch made by a Texas blacksmith's son in 1934. But he told her what the arrangement reminded him of. He said certain repeating clusters had the shape of ratios. He said that a particular recurring bracket structure functioned the way a parenthesis functions, grouping terms. He said that if he had to guess, and he stressed that he was guessing, He would say that at least one section of it described a relationship between two frequencies. Then he took his glasses off and said something that Hayes wrote down word for word. He said, "Whoever made this was not trying to tell you anything about themselves. They were trying to tell you how to build something. The pilot had not carried a message. The pilot had carried a manual. We have to talk about the body, and we should do it carefully, because this is the part of the story where every version tends to lose its discipline. The newspaper said the pilot was badly disfigured, but that enough remained to show he was not of this world. It offered no description beyond that. No height, no colour, no number of limbs, nothing. That absence is worth sitting with for a moment. If you're inventing a hoax in 1897 to bring tourists to your dying town, you do not leave out the description. The description is the entire product. You write about enormous eyes and grey skin and 6 fingers, because that is what people will come to see. Hayden wrote none of it. He wrote one careful sentence and stopped. The journal fills in what the town remembered, and what the town remembered is stranger than any of the usual imagery, precisely because it is so ordinary. The body was roughly human. Roughly, not exactly. The proportions were described as wrong in a way that people struggle to articulate. Slightly too long in the forearm, the head slightly too large for the shoulders, skin that was described as grey, but which one man insisted was not grey at all, and was simply what any skin looks like when the blood has stopped. It was small, perhaps 4.5 feet, though the body was damaged and curled and nobody straightened it. It had 2 arms, 2 legs, a head, a torso. It wore a fitted one-piece garment of a smooth material that had not burned in the crash and could not be cut with a knife. And it was, everyone agreed, dead. Here is the part the conspiracy hangs on. It carried nothing. No tools, not a wrench, not a blade, not a fastener, not anything that a person operating a complex machine might reasonably be expected to have somewhere on their body. No weapon of any kind, no food, no water, no container that had ever held either, no identification, no insignia, no marking on the garment, no badge, no rank, no name, nothing sewn or stamped or printed anywhere. Think about what that means for a moment. Every human expedition that has ever left home has carried identification, because identification is what you bring when there is a chance you will be found by someone who does not know you. We put names on dog tags. We put flags on spacecraft. We bolted a gold plaque onto Pioneer with a map on it, because the possibility of being found by strangers is the one contingency that every traveller plans for. This traveller had planned for no such thing, which means either that being found was inconceivable, or that being found was irrelevant, and Hayes came to believe it was the second. The body carried exactly one object. It was in a fitted pocket over the left side of the chest, and the journal describes it as a smooth cylinder of the same grey metal as the hull, roughly the size and shape of a pocket watch, though thicker, with no seam, no hinge, no winding stem, no aperture of any kind. It was described as being slightly warm, not hot. Warm the way a stone is warm at the end of an afternoon. Several men handled it. It was passed around, in the barn, in the middle of the afternoon of April 17th, 1897, before the stranger came in and saw what they were doing. According to the journal, that was the only time anyone saw the stranger's composure break. He crossed the barn in about 4 steps and took it out of the blacksmith's hand without a word, and as it passed between them, it opened. The journal is emphatic that nobody touched a catch, because there was no catch. It simply came apart along a line that had not been there a moment earlier, and the 2 halves separated by perhaps an inch and stopped, held apart by nothing. And light came out of it. Not a beam, not a glow. The light stood in the air above the open cylinder, in a rough sphere about the width of a dinner plate, and it was not blank. It was full of points, small, sharp, uncountable points of light at different depths, some brighter than others, arranged in 3 dimensions in the air of a Texas barn in 1897. in front of 11 men who had never seen a photograph move, let alone anything like this. And the points were turning, slowly, all together, as though the entire sphere were rotating on an axis that ran diagonally through it. The blacksmith's son wrote down what his father said about that moment, and it is the only sentence in the entire journal that is underlined. He said, "It was not a picture of the sky. It was the sky from somewhere else." The stranger closed his hands over the cylinder, and it shut. He put it inside his coat. He looked at each of the 11 men in turn for what the journal describes as an uncomfortably long time, and then he told them that they had seen an electrical apparatus of the kind used in stage illusions, and that they would not benefit from discussing it. And then, according to the journal, he said one more thing, which the writer's father repeated only twice in his life, both times when he had been drinking. He said, "I am sorry. He was not supposed to be found." It took Rebecca Hayes 2 more years to find the name. She did not find it in a leaked document. There was no source in a parking garage, no envelope under a door, none of the theatre that these stories usually come wrapped in. She found it the way researchers actually find things, which is by reading an enormous quantity of extremely boring paper until a single word stops being boring. The paper in question was a set of War Department appropriations records from the 1890s, held in a federal archive, digitized badly, in a collection that had been requested by researchers 11 times in 40 years, mostly by people writing about the Spanish-American War. 19th century government accounting was not designed to hide anything. It was designed to satisfy Congress. Every dollar had to be justified to somebody, and the somebodies were frequently hostile. What this means, practically, is that the paper trail of the 1890s is dense, redundant, and organised around the movement of money rather than the movement of secrets, which is precisely why an accountant is more dangerous to a conspiracy than a spy. Hayes was looking for unusual disbursements to Texas in the spring and summer of 1897. Anything anomalous. Payments to individuals, transport costs, storage. What she found was a line item repeated quarterly for 11 years, under the general heading of Ordnance Materials Examination. The line item read, "Contingent expenses, Lantern." Not a place, not a contractor, not an abbreviation of anything else in the ledger, just Lantern, capitalized, appearing without explanation in 11 years of federal accounting, and then, in 1908, disappearing from that ledger and reappearing in another under a different heading, with the same quarterly figure. She traced it forward for 3 months. It never stopped. It changed headings 8 times between 1897 and 1947. It changed departments 4 times. The figure grew, slowly at first and then very quickly during the First World War, and then it left the ordinary appropriation structure entirely in the early 1940s and vanished into a wartime classification regime from which Hayes could not follow it. But she had 11 years of clean paper, and in those 11 years she found supporting documentation, requisitions, transport authorizations, personnel assignments, property transfers, and one memorandum dated the 22nd of April, 1897, 5 days after the crash, which is the closest thing this entire story has to a smoking gun. It is 1 page. It is addressed to an assistant secretary. It concerns the disposition of recovered materials, and it does not say from where, or of what kind, or belonging to whom. It says that the recovery at the Texas site is complete. It says that local disposition has been arranged in accordance with standing practice. It says that the site is to be considered closed, and it identifies the matter by file designation. Lantern, case number 7. Hayes sat in an archive reading room with that page in front of her for a very long time, because a case number 7 means, necessarily and inescapably, that there were 6 before it. Aurora, Texas, April 17th, 1897, is the most famous alleged aerial recovery in 19th century America. It is the one with the newspaper article and the cemetery, and the historical marker. It is the one everybody knows, and in the paperwork it is not even the first. She never found cases 1 through 6. She looked for 4 years. The earlier files, if they exist, are either in a classification tier she could not reach, or were destroyed, or were never centralised in the first place, which for the 1870s and 1880s is entirely plausible. But she found the standing practice. That phrase appears twice more in the Lantern Papers, both times without elaboration, in the flat, confident way that bureaucracies refer to procedures everyone already knows. Standing practice, meaning a written protocol, meaning an established repeatable method for handling the recovery of an unexplained aerial object, already in place, already refined, already routine, in April of 1897. Someone had done this before, enough times to write it down. Here is what the standing practice looked like in 1897, reconstructed from transport records that Hayes assembled over 18 months. It is not dramatic. That is what makes it convincing. The obvious way to move several tons of recovered material out of North Texas in 1897 is by rail. Rail is fast. Rail is capable. Rail is what everything moved on. They did not use rail. Rail generates paper. A rail car has a number, and a manifest and a destination and a schedule. It has a station agent at each end who signs for it. It has a route that is public knowledge, and a sealed rail car travelling under military guard is, in a town of 300 people in 1897, approximately the most interesting thing that has ever happened. So instead, according to the requisitions, they hired wagons. Ordinary farm wagons, not government wagons, not army transport, hired, locally, from teamsters in 3 different counties, in small numbers, over 11 days. The wreckage was disassembled in Judge Proctor's field over the better part of a week, into pieces small enough that no single piece would draw attention. The heavy structural elements were cut down. The hull plating was stacked flat and crated in boxes labelled as agricultural machinery components, and then the wagons left, separately, on different days, by different roads. One went south toward Weatherford, one went east, 2 went northeast toward the Red River. One went nowhere in particular for 4 days, and then turned around. None of them carried a complete anything. That is the detail Hayes kept returning to, because it reveals the mind behind the operation. The point was not merely to move the material secretly. The point was to ensure that no person involved in moving it, at any stage, ever saw enough of it to know what it was. A teamster hauling 4 crates of scrap metal from Aurora to a rail yard in Weatherford has not witnessed a cover-up. He has done a day's work for a day's pay. If you ask him about it 30 years later, he will not have a story, because from where he was sitting there was no story. There was a load. Compartmentalization was not invented in the 20th century. It was just not usually written down before then. The crates converged over roughly 5 weeks at an army arsenal, arriving from 4 directions under 4 different inventory descriptions. Hayes found the receiving records. The material enters the property books as variously damaged agricultural implements, salvage iron for reduction, foreign manufactured samples for testing, and one entry that simply reads miscellaneous 31 crates. At no point in the entire chain of documentation does any single record describe an aircraft, a vessel, a machine, a body, or an object of unknown origin. The complete thing exists nowhere in the paperwork. It only exists if you assemble the paperwork, which nobody did for 100 and some years, because there was no reason to, and because the pieces sat in 4 different record groups in 3 different facilities. And the body. The body is the one place where the standing practice did something unexpected, and it is the reason there is a grave at all. The obvious move is to take it, quietly at night, with no ceremony, and let the town wonder. They did not do that. According to the journal, the stranger explicitly instructed the town to proceed with the burial, to do it publicly, to do it with a minister present and hymns and the whole congregation on the morning of the 18th of April, exactly as they would have done for any stranger who died in their county. He told them to mark the grave. He told them to talk about it. Hayes could not understand this for a long time, and then one afternoon she understood it completely, and she said afterward that it was the moment the whole thing turned from a puzzle into something that frightened her. If you remove the body in secret, you create a mystery, and a mystery generates investigators forever. If you let the town bury it in daylight with hymns, you create a legend, and a legend is the safest possible container for a true thing. Because a legend does not demand proof. A legend is repeated affectionately, embellished a little each time, and within 2 generations it has grown so many decorative branches that no serious person will go near it. The tourists come, the historical marker goes up, the town sells a few postcards, and every professional historian in America files it under 19th century newspaper hoax and never opens the file again. They did not bury the pilot to hide him. They buried him to make him unbelievable. And then, at some point in the years that followed, on a night nobody recorded, with lanterns and a wagon and no hurry at all, someone came back and took him out of the ground. Because the burial had done its job, the wreckage arrived at the arsenal in 31 crates, and then it sat. Not because anybody wanted it to, because there was, quite simply, nothing that anyone in 1897 could do with it. Hayes recovered fragments of the technical correspondence from the first decade of Lantern, and it is, in its way, one of the saddest documents in the whole story. It is the sound of extremely capable people failing, politely, in writing, for 11 years. The first thing they tried was the obvious thing. They tried to melt it. 19th century metallurgy was not primitive. Steel production was industrial and sophisticated. The engineers at that arsenal understood furnaces, alloys, tempering and casting at a level that would still be respectable today. The material did not melt. It reached the maximum temperature the facility could produce, and it did not soften, did not glow the way iron glows, did not deform. One report notes with evident frustration that a sample removed from the furnace was cool enough to handle with gloves within 90 seconds, which is not how metal behaves. They tried to cut it. Saws failed. Chisels failed. Drills failed. They tried acid. The chemical section reported no measurable effect from any reagent available to them, and then somebody, in what was probably an act of exasperation, put a fragment of hull plating in a bench vise and bent it. And it bent, easily, with very little force. A thin sheet of a material that could not be cut, drilled, dissolved or melted, folded under the pressure of one man's hand like a piece of soft leather. And then, over the following 4 or 5 seconds, it unfolded itself, not springing back the way spring steel snaps back, slowly, smoothly, continuously. The crease travelled out toward the edges and diminished and was gone, and the sheet lay flat on the bench with no mark on it whatsoever. The report describing this is 1 paragraph long, and reads as though the writer is being extremely careful not to sound excited. They repeated it, of course, dozens of times, hundreds. They folded samples, creased them, hammered them, rolled them, twisted them. Everyone returned to flat. They left a folded sample clamped in a vise for 11 months to see whether the material could be persuaded to accept a permanent deformation under sustained pressure. When they released it, it took slightly longer than usual to recover, and then it recovered, completely. The corrosion test ran even longer. Samples were left in salt solution, in acid, buried in soil, exposed on a roof in the open air. Some of those experiments ran for over a decade. The reports at the 5-year and 10-year marks say the same thing. No change. There is a note in 1904 from an engineer whose name is redacted in the copy Hayes obtained, that steps outside the technical register for exactly 2 sentences. He writes that he has spent 7 years attempting to reproduce a material he does not understand, using methods he now believes are not merely insufficient but categorically wrong. in the way that a man attempting to build a clock out of water is not merely unskilled. And then he writes, "We're not behind them, we're elsewhere." They never reproduced it, not in the 11 years, not in 50. But that is not the same as learning nothing. Because here is the thing about failure at that scale, sustained for that long by that many good people. It is enormously productive in every direction, except the one you were aiming at. They did not make the alloy, but in trying to melt it, they built better furnaces. In trying to cut it, they developed harder tool steels. In trying to understand why it returned to shape, they were forced into questions about crystalline structure and grain boundaries and elastic memory that ordinary metallurgy in 1900 had no reason to ask. And in trying to understand the engraved symbols, over decades, a small group of lantern personnel worked on the mathematics of resonance and frequency relationships years before there was any practical application for it. That is the shape of the conspiracy, and it is worth being precise about it, because the sloppy version of this story is that the government reverse-engineered a flying saucer and gave us the transistor. That is not what the Lantern Papers describe. What they describe is much stranger and much more plausible. They describe a program that failed at its assigned task for half a century, and in failing, dragged American engineering into a series of questions that nobody else in the world was asking yet. They never copied the answer. They just spent 50 years staring at it, and could not help learning something. Every long-running secret needs a building, not a bunker, not a mountain. Those come later, and they come with a cost, because an enormous secret facility is itself a signal. A hole in a mountain tells you that somebody had something worth putting in a mountain. What Lantern had instead, according to Hayes, was better. It had an unremarkable brick building on the grounds of an ordinary army arsenal, with a sign on it, listed in the property books, appearing in the annual reports, visited by inspectors, and entirely, publicly, boringly explained. Officially, it was a metallurgical research section. That was not a lie, it genuinely was one. It did genuine metallurgical research and published genuine unclassified papers on alloy behaviour under stress, some of which are still cited in the technical literature. Officers were assigned to it, budgets were reviewed, congressmen occasionally toured it and were shown the furnaces. Roughly 90% of the work that happened in that building was exactly what the sign said. The other 10% was Aurora. This is what Hayes came to believe was the real genius of the operation, and the reason it survived for so long without leaking. There was no secret facility to discover. There was a real laboratory doing real work, with a real budget and a real staff and real published output, inside which a small number of people spent part of their time on something else. The cover was not a story. The cover was a job. Personnel records show the pattern clearly once you know to look for it. Certain officers assigned to that section stayed there for decades, which is deeply abnormal in a military career structure built around rotation. Promotion boards passed over them repeatedly, and they did not complain, and they did not transfer, and several of them declined assignments that would have advanced their careers considerably. They were not being punished. Their efficiency reports were uniformly excellent. They simply never left. Hayes assembled a list of 31 names across 5 decades of people who entered that building's orbit and never meaningfully departed from it. Some retired and were immediately rehired as civilian consultants. Some retired and continued to appear in the visitor logs monthly for another 20 years. 2 of them, on retirement, moved to houses within 4 miles of the Arsenal gate, and lived there until they died, and their obituaries, when she found them, are almost identical in structure. They describe long careers in government metallurgy. They list professional associations. They are respectful, modest, and completely uninformative. Not one of them, in 5 decades, is known to have said a word. Hayes tracked down surviving family members of 11 of the 31. She was open with all of them about what she was researching, and most of them were friendly. and none of them had anything. But 4 separate families, independently, in 4 different states, told her a version of the same small thing. They said that their father, or their grandfather, had one rule. He did not talk about work. That was normal. Plenty of people in that era did not talk about work. The rule was more specific than that. They said he would not discuss the weather in a certain way, that if the conversation at the dinner table turned to something in the sky, an unusual light, a comet, a story on the news, he would stand up and leave the room, not angrily, not making a scene. He would simply get up and go and do something else, and come back 10 minutes later as though nothing had happened. One woman, whose grandfather had worked in that building from 1931 until 1968, told Hayes that she had asked him about it exactly once, when she was 15, because a friend at school had seen something and it was all anyone was talking about. She said he was quiet for a while, and then he said, "I spent my whole life trying to understand one small piece of something, and I never did, and neither will anyone else, and that is the good outcome. You want the people who work on this to fail. Ask me something else. The laboratory never closed." Hayes traced it forward through 8 decades, and the pattern is not one of secrecy in the cinematic sense. It is a pattern of institutional drift. The building itself was demolished in the 1950s, which sounds like an ending and is not. What happened is what always happens to government programs. It was reorganized, its functions were transferred, its personnel were reassigned as a block, its files moved to a successor office with a new designation and a new letterhead and the same 3 people running it. It became, in sequence, a materials division, then a special projects office, then a component of a larger research command, then a line item inside a laboratory system, then a program element inside a directorate. Each transition was documented. Each one was legitimate. Each one was approved by people who had every reason to believe they were signing a routine administrative consolidation, because that is exactly what the paperwork said, and because in almost every respect that is exactly what it was. The knowledge did not travel in the documents, it travelled in the people, and what those people worked on, publicly, over 80 years, is a reasonable summary of the 20th century in American aerospace. High-strength, lightweight alloys, materials that hold their properties at extreme temperatures, radar-absorbent and radar-reflective structures, airframe design for regimes where ordinary metals fail, composites, coatings, fatigue behavior, elastic recovery. Now. Here is where the conspiracy makes its largest claim, and it is worth being honest about how large it is. The strong version of this story says that every major leap in American aerospace traces back to one recovered fragment from Aurora, Texas. That the jet age, the space program, stealth technology, all of it, comes from a hull plate in a crate. Hayes did not believe the strong version, and neither should you, and here is the reason. The engineers who built the 20th century have names. Their work is documented in obsessive detail. You can read the notebooks. You can trace the false starts, the arguments, the dead ends, the 20-year gaps between an idea and a working example. The history of aviation is not a history of sudden gifts. It is a history of grinding, iterative, extremely well-documented human effort by people who left behind mountains of evidence of having thought their way there themselves. The strong version of the Aurora conspiracy insults every one of them, and it is almost certainly false. What Hayes came to believe is the weak version, and the weak version is far more unsettling, because you cannot easily dismiss it. The weak version is this: nobody was handed an answer, nobody copied anything, but for 80 years a small number of extremely talented American engineers knew, with certainty, that a specific set of things were possible. They knew that a metal could exist which recovers its shape completely and indefinitely, because they had one in a drawer and they had bent it 400 times. They knew that a material could exist which does not corrode. because they had one buried in the ground behind the building for a decade and dug it up unchanged. They knew that a structure could survive an impact that should have destroyed it. They did not know how. They never learned how. But they knew that it was not impossible, and everyone else in the world was only guessing. And that is not nothing. That is, in fact, an enormous advantage, and it does not require a single stolen blueprint to explain. Because the most expensive thing in research is not the answer. It is the years spent working on a problem you're not sure has a solution. It is the funding you cannot get, and the reviewer who says it violates known principles, and the 12 promising directions you abandon because you have no way to know which one leads anywhere. Certainty about what is achievable is worth more than any diagram. If you know the destination exists, you will find a road to it eventually. Any road. Your own road. You will just get there decades before the people who were not sure it was there at all. That, according to the conspiracy, is what Aurora actually gave the United States. Not technology, confidence. We should talk about July of 1947, because everything in this story bends around it. You know the outline. Something came down on a ranch in New Mexico. The Army airfield at Roswell issued a press release stating that they had recovered a flying disc. The story went out on the wire within hours, and then, before the day was over, a second announcement was made correcting the first, and the object became a weather balloon, and later a research balloon from a classified project, and the whole thing collapsed into the longest-running argument in American folklore. Set aside, for tonight, the question of what was actually on that ranch. That is a different episode and a much longer argument. Look instead at the shape of what happened. At Aurora, in 1897, according to the conspiracy, an unidentified man arrived within hours, took control of a site in a town of 300 people, moved the material out in pieces over 11 days, arranged a public burial as camouflage, and left behind nothing but a newspaper article that history dismissed as a hoax. Total lapse time from event to closure. 5 days. Total public awareness generated. 1 inside page item in a regional newspaper. Total investigative pressure. None. For 76 years. That is a flawless operation. Whatever else you think about it, on its own terms, it worked perfectly. Now look at 1947. The information was out on the national wire before anyone senior had been briefed. It was in newspapers on both coasts within a day. There were reporters on the ground. There were phone calls from other countries. And the correction, the balloon story, was issued so fast and so publicly that it created the single most durable suspicion in the history of American conspiracy thinking. If you announce something and retract it within 24 hours, you have not concealed anything. You have installed a permanent question in the national memory. So why the difference? The conventional answer is that 1947 was a media environment, and 1897 was not, and there is real truth in that. But the conspiracy's answer goes further, and it is genuinely elegant. By 1947, the government did not lack experience. It had 50 years of it. Lantern had been running continuously since April of 1897. There was a written standing practice. There were people alive and on the payroll who had personally handled this kind of material for their entire careers. The problem in 1947 was not inexperience. The problem was that the standing practice required something that no longer existed. Every element of the Aurora Protocol depends on one condition, that you get there first and that information travels slower than you do. In 1897, that condition was automatic. News moved at the speed of a telegraph line, and telegraph lines went to specific places, and there was no telegraph office in Aurora. A rider had to carry the story to Rome or Decatur before it could go anywhere at all. That is a delay of hours, and hours are all you need. In 1947, an Army public information officer at an airfield had a telephone and a wire service relationship, and he used them, competently and immediately, exactly as he had been trained to do. The story was national before the people who knew what to do with it had been told there was anything to do. And once that has happened, the Aurora playbook is useless, You cannot arrange a quiet public burial to convert an event into folklore when the event is already on the front page. You cannot dismantle it into farm wagons when reporters are counting trucks. All you have left is the crudest tool in the kit, which is flat contradiction. So they issued the balloon statement, and it held mostly for 30 years. It was not elegant. It was not the standing practice. It was an improvisation by an institution that had 50 years of experience at doing this quietly, and no experience whatsoever at doing it loudly. Roswell was not the beginning. Roswell was the first failure of a procedure that had worked 8 or 9 or 12 times before, in towns nobody remembers, because when the procedure works correctly, there is nothing left to remember. Aurora is where the playbook was written. Roswell is where the playbook stopped working. And the reason you have heard of Roswell and not of Aurora is not that Roswell was more real. It is that Aurora was handled properly. The cylinder is where this story stops being about history and starts being about something else. Because the cylinder went into the stranger's coat on the afternoon of April 17th, 1897, and then it went into the lantern inventory, and then for 54 years it did nothing at all. They could not open it. The technical correspondence is almost comic about it. It has no seam, one report notes, with what reads like personal offence, and yet it opens. 11 men have testified that it opens. It has been observed to open. It does not open. They tried everything they had tried on the hull plating with the same results. Heat did nothing. Pressure did nothing. It could not be cut or drilled. Immersion did nothing. Electrical current, applied at increasing voltages over 3 separate test series in 1902, 1911 and 1929, did nothing. They interviewed the surviving witnesses more than once, decades apart, and got the same account each time. Nobody touched anything. It was passing from one hand to another, and it came apart. In 1938, a section chief wrote a summary of 41 years of work on the object, and his conclusion was 1 sentence long. He wrote, "It opened for someone, and it has not opened for us, and I believe that is the entire finding. Then came the war, and then came the years after the war, and the equipment changed." According to the conspiracy, the cylinder opened in the winter of 1951, not because anyone forced it, because someone finally read the instructions. Remember the engraved fragments. Remember the retired professor telling Rebecca Hayes, 70 years later, that certain clusters looked like ratios, and that at least one section appeared to describe a relationship between 2 frequencies. Lantern had been staring at those symbols since 1897. For most of that time they had no way to act on them, because generating a precisely controlled frequency was not something you could do in 1897, or 1910, or 1925. By 1951, it was routine. So they built what the fragments described, a pair of tones in a specific ratio at specific frequencies, sustained. And on the 3rd attempt, in a shielded room with 4 people present, the cylinder came apart along a line that had not been there, and stopped and held itself open on nothing, and the light came out. The 1951 observers described exactly what 11 farmers in a Texas barn had described 54 years earlier. A sphere of points, roughly the width of a dinner plate. Different depths, different brightnesses, rotating slowly, all together, on a diagonal axis. But the 1951 observers had something the farmers did not. They had astronomers. And when the astronomers looked at it, they stopped being scientists for about a minute and became people looking at something they could not process, because they recognized it. Not immediately, not from where they were standing. It took a week of photography and measurement, and then a mathematician did the transformation, and the answer came out. It was the local stellar neighborhood. Every star within a certain distance of the sun positioned correctly in 3 dimensions, with the sun itself included and not centered. The viewpoint was from outside, from somewhere off to one side, which is why nobody recognized the constellations. Constellations only exist from here. And it was not a static picture. The rotation was not decorative. Over hours of observation, the positions changed slightly relative to one another. The astronomers realized they were watching proper motion, the actual drift of actual stars, running at an enormously accelerated rate, cycling through a span of time and returning to the start. Somebody worked out the period of the cycle. The map was showing them roughly 26,000 years of stellar motion on a loop. Within the sphere, 4 objects were rendered differently from the stars, not points, small, distinct, marked. Earth, the Moon, Mars, and one more, out among the nearer stars, at a distance the astronomers could estimate but never confirm. And that 4th one was not steady. It pulsed, slowly, rhythmically, continuously, in a pattern that did not vary and did not stop for as long as anyone watched it, in 1951 and in every year afterward. The first assumption was the obvious one. The device was a beacon, and the pulsing marker was where it was calling home. That assumption held for 19 years. It was wrong. The correction came in 1970, and it came from a junior person, which is how these things usually go. A young analyst, going back through 19 years of continuous monitoring records because someone senior wanted a summary for a review, noticed something that everyone before her had looked straight past. The pulse was not being generated. She could demonstrate it, and her demonstration was elegant and slightly cruel to 19 years of assumptions. If the device were transmitting, the pulse would originate at the device. It would be a property of the machine. It would be, in the most basic sense, the machine's own behaviour, and it would therefore be perfectly regular in the machine's own frame of reference. It was not perfectly regular. It had a variation in it, a very small one, and the variation had a shape, and the shape was familiar to anybody who has ever tracked a signal from a moving source, because it was a Doppler pattern. The pulse was arriving. The device was not a transmitter. It was a receiver, and it had been receiving continuously without interruption for as long as anyone had been listening. The marker in the star map was not a destination. It was a source, and the moment that was understood, someone asked the question that changed the entire program, which was, how long has it been receiving? The answer was in the star map itself, because the map ran on a cycle, and the cycle was calibrated, and the position of the loop at any given moment corresponded to a specific point in time. The map was not just a chart, it was a clock. It had been running since long before 1897, and it was still running, and it could be read. They read it, and then they compared the signal record against it, and they found the thing that made the Lantern program in 1970, quietly and permanently terrified. The signal changes, not often. The content of the pulse pattern is stable for very long periods, and then it shifts into a different pattern, and then it is stable again. And the shifts are periodic, every 73 years. They could identify the changes going back a considerable distance in the map's internal record, and when they laid the intervals out and worked forward, 2 dates fell out of the arithmetic that stopped the room. The first change in the modern record occurred in 1897, the same year the craft came down in Aurora, Texas. And the second occurred in 1970, the year they figured it out. Sit with the first one for a moment, because it is the one that reorders everything. For 73 years, Lantern had operated on the assumption that Aurora was an accident. A machine developed a fault, lost altitude, hit a windmill, and a pilot died. Bad luck. Mechanical failure. The universe being indifferent. But if the signal changed in 1897, then the crash and the change happened in the same year, and there are only 2 possibilities. Either it is coincidence, or the pilot was responding to it, not surveying, not exploring, not watching us. Coming down in a damaged craft, moving too slowly, at the wrong altitude, over a specific patch of North Texas, in the same year that something he had been listening to for a very long time finally said something new. He was not passing through, he was answering. And the second date is the one that is genuinely difficult to think about lying in the dark. Because if the interval is 73 years, and the changes fall in 1897 and 1970, then the next one does not fall in some comfortable abstract future. Add 73 to 1970. The next change falls in 2043, which is not 100 years away. It is not 1,000. It is not a date that belongs to a civilization that will have forgotten us. It is close enough that most of the people listening to this tonight will be alive for it. And Lantern, or whatever Lantern is called now, has known that date since 1970, which means that every year since then, somebody in a windowless office has updated a number on a page, and the number has gotten smaller, and nobody outside that office has ever been told what the number is counting down to. Rebecca Hayes went to the cemetery at night. She was not proud of it. She wrote about it afterward in the flat, defensive way that careful people write about, the one time they did something they knew was wrong, and she never published that section. She went in October, on a Tuesday, with a folding spade, a headlamp with a red filter, and a tarpaulin. She had spent 3 weeks watching the road and knew that nobody came out that way after 9 in the evening. She dug at the western fence, at the spot where the rough carved stone had been photographed before 1973, working carefully around the iron pipes that had been driven into the ground there. It took her most of the night, and she was down further than she expected before she found anything, because a 19th century grave in Texas clay does not give up its edges easily, and because she was being very careful. She found the coffin first, or what was left of it. A rectangular shadow in the soil, a few flakes of wood, a scatter of square-cut iron nails still holding the shape of something that had rotted away entirely. And inside the shadow there was nothing. No bones, not a fragment, not a tooth. Hayes understood soil chemistry well enough to know that this alone proves less than it seems to. Acidic soil destroys skeletal material over a century. Plenty of 19th century graves contain nothing recognisable, but an empty coffin is not a disturbed one, and this one had been disturbed. The nails were not in the pattern of a lid that had rotted in place. They were scattered above and below the coffin line, mixed through the fill, in the way that happens when a box is opened from the top with a bar, and the fill is shoveled back in afterward by people working in the dark. Somebody had opened it. And then, underneath where the floor of the coffin would have been, 6 inches deeper into undisturbed clay, her spade struck stone. It was not a rock. It was flat and it was cut, and when she cleared the soil off it she found a rectangular plaque roughly the size of a large book, made of a pale stone she could not identify, polished smooth on its upper face. And covering that face, edge to edge, in dense, unbroken lines, without borders or flourishes or empty space, were the marks, the same marks, the ones from the hull fragments, the ones a retired professor of electrical engineering had told her were not writing but notation. Hayes sat in a hole in the ground in Aurora, Texas at 4 in the morning and understood. The grave had never held a body, or rather, it had held one briefly, for exactly as long as was useful, and then that had been removed because the body was never the point. The plaque was the point. Think about what a marker requires, not the modern kind, a real one, meant to survive. It cannot be advertised because anything advertised will be looted or moved or built over within a few generations. It cannot be hidden completely either, because a perfectly hidden thing is lost, and a lost marker is worthless. What it requires is protection without attention. A place that will not be developed, will not be ploughed, will not be quarried, will not be sold for a shopping centre. A place that a community will maintain for centuries out of ordinary human obligation, and will defend if threatened, and will not dig up. There is exactly one kind of place like that, a cemetery. And if you want to guarantee that one specific plot in that cemetery will never be disturbed, never be reused, never be built over, never be forgotten, and will in fact be actively defended in court by people who have no idea what they are defending, then you do not put up a fence. You bury something under it that the community will not permit anyone to disturb. You give them a story about a stranger from the sky, and you let them bury him with hymns, and you let the legend grow, and 11 decades later, a cemetery association will spend real money on real lawyers to stop anyone from putting a shovel into that ground. The pilot's grave was not a grave. It was a lock, and the town was the key, and none of them ever knew. Hayes photographed the plaque, filled the hole in, replaced the sod as well as she could in the dark, and drove back to her motel with clay under her fingernails and her hands shaking on the wheel. It took her 8 months to understand what the plaque said, and she never fully did. What she worked out, with help from 3 people who each believed they were solving an unrelated puzzle, was one section of it. It was not a message, it was a position, a set of relationships expressed as ratios rather than as distances, because ratios survive translation between measurement systems and distances do not. The relationships describe the geometry of a triangle, anchored to 2 features and pointing at a third. The 2 anchors were the cemetery, and a bend in a creek that has not moved since the survey maps of 1854. The third point was the site of Judge Proctor's windmill. The Proctor property has been open pasture since the 1920s. The house burned, the barn came down. The windmill was never rebuilt after 1897, because a windmill costs money and Aurora had none. But the foundation is still there. 4 squat piers of local stone sunk into the clay, worn down almost to ground level, invisible in summer when the grass is high. Hayes went out there with the landowner's permission, ostensibly to photograph the site for a historical piece, which was not entirely a lie. The geometry pointed to a spot roughly at the centre of the 4 piers. She came back 3 weeks later at night, with better tools and a great deal more fear. What she found, 4 feet down, was not a chamber in the cinematic sense. There was no door, no staircase, no corridor lit by inexplicable ambient light. There was a shaft, circular, about the width of a dinner plate, lined with the same pale stone as the plaque, dropping straight down into the clay further than her headlamp could reach. The upper end had been sealed with a stone plug that fit so precisely that she found the seam only by touch, and that lifted out cleanly when she worked a bar under its edge. And about a foot down the shaft, mounted on the wall of it, on a short bracket of grey metal that had not corroded in 120-some years, was a cradle, a shaped recess, smooth, machined to a tolerance that made her stomach turn over. It was empty, and it was, to within any accuracy she could measure with a tape and a camera, exactly the size and shape of a smooth metal cylinder, roughly the dimensions of a pocket watch, though thicker, with no seam and no hinge. She sat back on her heels in the wet grass in the middle of a Texas pasture and put it together. He was not surveying us. He was not lost. He was not exploring, or invading, or observing, or any of the things that we, in our enormous self-regard, always assume a visitor must be doing, because we cannot conceive of anyone coming here for a reason that is not about us. He was making a delivery. He came down slowly, at treetop height, over one specific quarter section of Wise County, Texas, in a damaged craft, because he was trying to reach a particular hole in the ground, in a particular pasture, and put something back into it. And he almost made it. The windmill was less than 80 feet from the shaft. Judge Proctor had built it there in 1889, over a good well, on a slight rise, in the sensible place a man builds a windmill. He put it directly in the flight path of the only thing that mattered, and he never knew, and the pilot could not have known either, because whoever surveyed that pasture last had done it before there were windmills. That is the whole tragedy of it, and it is almost unbearably small. Not a war, not a mission of conquest, not a message to humanity. A courier, at the end of a very long journey, who was killed by a piece of farm equipment. There is one more document. It surfaced in a declassification release, the ordinary kind, the sort that produces 400 boxes of tedium and one thing that nobody reviewing it recognised as important. It was a wax cylinder. Phonograph recording on wax cylinder was commercially available in 1897, and army officers of that era were often exactly the sort of technically curious people who owned one. The recording is catalogued in the finding aid as Field Acoustic Sample Texas, undated, and it sat in a box for a very long time because nothing in that description suggests anything at all. It is about 40 seconds long. For the first 11 seconds you can hear a room, boots on a wooden floor, a man clearing his throat. Somebody says something at a distance that is not intelligible. Then a voice close to the horn says a date, the 19th of April, 1897, and then, for the remaining 29 seconds, there are tones. They are faint. They are almost lost in the surface noise of a wax cylinder that has been sitting in a box for over a century. They are not musical in any sense a listener would recognise. They do not resolve into a melody or a rhythm you could tap along to. To the ear they sound like a very distant, very slow set of overlapping hums, changing pitch in a way that seems arbitrary. The officer who made the recording wrote nothing about what he was recording. Modern analysis of the recording is straightforward technically. You clean the surface noise, separate the frequency components, and measure them. And the tones are not arbitrary. They are pairs. Each pair holds a fixed ratio. The ratios are the same ratios that appear over and over in the engraved symbols on the hull fragments and on the stone plaque under an empty grave in a Texas cemetery. It is the same notation rendered as sound, which means the cylinder was not silent in that barn. It had been speaking the entire time in a register and at a volume that the 11 men standing around it could not consciously hear, and one army officer, for reasons he never recorded, thought to point a phonograph horn at it. The translation is not certain. Let us be honest about that. It is a reconstruction, built by mapping the notational structure onto its most probable mathematical reading, and different people have arrived at slightly different phrasings. But every reconstruction agrees on the shape of it, and the shape of it is two statements. The first is a status. The second is an instruction. Rendered into English, as closely as the structure permits, it reads, "Custodian unavailable. Await replacement." Read it again, slowly, and notice everything it does not say. It does not say help. It does not say danger. It does not identify itself, or explain, or request, or warn. It is not addressed to us at all. It is a status report, filed automatically by a system reporting on its own condition. The way a sensor reports that a valve has failed, the way an unmanned station reports that it has lost contact with an operator. Custodian unavailable. The custodian is the man in the barn, the one lying under a tarpaulin in the corner with his forearms slightly too long and no identification of any kind, because identification is for people who might be found by strangers, and he was never going to be found by strangers because he was not visiting. He worked here. Await replacement. Which tells you, in 2 words, that the position exists independently of the man, that there was a custodian before him, and that there is expected to be one after. That this is not an expedition or a mission or a first contact. It is a post, and somebody has been filling it for a very long time. Here is what Rebecca Hayes came to believe, and here is why she stopped writing about it. The star map runs on a cycle of roughly 26,000 years. The signal changes every 73 years. The shaft under the windmill was cut into stone by tools that left no marks, at a depth and a tolerance that nobody in Texas in 1897 could have achieved, at a site that was pasture when the first survey party came through in the 1850s, and had been pasture, as far as anyone knows, since the last ice age. Whatever that shaft is part of, it did not arrive in 1897. It was here first, before Aurora, before Texas, before the Comanche and the Caddo and the Wichita, before agriculture, before the last glacial maximum when the place we now call North Texas was cold grassland, and there were mammoths on it, and the first human beings on this continent had not yet walked south past the ice. And it has needed maintenance. That is the detail that undoes you, if you let it. Not the scale, the maintenance. Grandeur is easy to absorb. An ancient alien monument is a comfortable idea, because a monument is finished. It just sits there being mysterious, and it does not imply anyone still cares. But something that requires a custodian is not finished. It is running. It has parts that degrade and a component that has to be physically carried down and seated in a cradle at intervals by hand by somebody who has to come here to do it. Which means that for as long as it has been here, somebody has been coming. Not to see us, not to guide us, not to intervene in any of the 10,000 years of history in which we would very much have appreciated an intervention, to do a job, arriving presumably at intervals long enough that no human civilization ever noticed a pattern, doing the work, leaving, filing nothing, explaining nothing, carrying nothing that would identify them, because being noticed was not a factor they had ever needed to plan for. And in April of 1897, for the first time in an unimaginably long run of successful visits, one of them was seen by farmers in the dawn over a public square in a dying cotton town in Wise County, Texas. And then he hit a windmill that had been built 8 years earlier by a grieving judge who wanted water for his cattle, and he died in a flower garden. And a station that had been running since before there were cities went into a fault state and began reporting patiently into the dark that its operator was unavailable and that a replacement was expected. And it has been reporting that ever since. That is what Hayes could not get past. Not the fear, the obligation. Because if the custodian never came back, then the job did not get done. And if the job did not get done, then whatever that thing is under the pasture has spent the entire 20th century running unattended, and it was not designed to. We did not steal a spacecraft in 1897. We inherited a responsibility, and we have never once known that we had it. And every year the number in the windowless office gets smaller. Hayes stopped writing because she realised she had nothing useful to publish. She had a scenario, a set of documents that were suggestive rather than conclusive, a plaque she had photographed illegally, and a hole in a pasture that she had refilled herself. And because, as she put it in the last entry in her file, the only two outcomes she could imagine were that nobody would believe her, or that somebody would. The Proctor place is pasture now. Cattle graze on it. In spring there are wildflowers along the fence line, blue bonnets and Indian paintbrush, and the grass comes up green and then goes gold by July. There is a gate and a cattle guard, and a dirt track running back from the road that turns to soup when it rains. If you did not know, you would never know. The 4 stone piers are still out there, worn down almost level, half swallowed by sod. In high summer you could walk directly across them without noticing. Visitors come sometimes, not many. Aurora is not on the way to anywhere, but a few times a year somebody with an interest in old mysteries will drive out from Fort Worth, take a photograph of the historical marker at the cemetery gate, walk the rows for 20 minutes looking for a grave that has no stone, and drive home. They tell their friends about it. It makes a good story at a dinner party. The Texas town where they buried a Martian in 1897. Everyone laughs. That is exactly as intended. Now, here is the last thing, and then I will let you sleep. One evening in late summer, not long ago, a maintenance worker was out on that pasture repairing a stretch of fence that a bull had walked through. It was near dusk. The light was going orange and long. He was working alone, which is how fence work usually gets done, and he was thinking about nothing in particular. Then he felt something in the soles of his boots, not a sound. He was clear about that afterward, to the 2 people he ever mentioned it to. He did not hear anything. He felt it, low in his feet and behind his knees, a vibration so deep and so slow that he first assumed a truck was coming up the road. No truck came. He stood still for a while, and then he looked down. There were small stones on the bare ground where the cattle had worn the grass away. Ordinary gravel, the size of a thumbnail. They were moving, not scattering, not rolling downhill. They were tracking slowly across the dirt in arcs, dozens of them, each one following a curve, and the curves were nested, and they were all turning in the same direction around a common centre. Perfect circles. He watched them for what he estimated was half a minute. and then the vibration stopped, and the stone stopped, and the pasture was just a pasture again in the last of the evening light. He finished the fence. He went home. He did not tell his wife. Deep beneath the old foundation, in a shaft cut into stone by something that left no tool marks, in a cradle that has been empty since April of 1897, something had turned over in its sleep. The 73-year cycle has begun again. Here is the misconception, and it is the one that everybody makes, including the men who spent 50 years in a brick building trying to melt a piece of it. Everyone assumed the craft over Aurora, Texas was arriving. That is what a UFO story is. Something comes here, from out there. That is the whole architecture of the idea, and we have never once questioned it, because it flatters us. It makes Earth the destination. It makes us the reason. But a courier at the end of a route is not arriving. He is returning. The station under that pasture was not built by anyone who came to visit us. It was here before us. It has been running continuously through the entire span of human history and a long way past the back of it. And the people who maintain it are not exploring the galaxy and stopping by. They are servicing infrastructure. Earth is not a discovery. Earth is a site. And in 1897, on an ordinary Saturday morning in a town that was already dying, a farming community in North Texas accidentally interrupted a maintenance visit that had been running on schedule since before the ice. They dressed him. They said words over him. They put him in the ground with hymns because they did not know what else to do for a stranger who had died in their field, and in doing so they were kinder to him than anyone else in this entire story. And they never had the faintest idea what they had stopped. History remembers the Aurora incident as a strange Texas legend from 1897. According to the conspiracy, it was the first time humanity accidentally interrupted an ancient mission that had been silently protecting this planet for thousands of years, and it is still waiting for someone to finish the job. That is where we will leave it tonight. There is a house in London that most people walk past without ever looking up. It stands on a narrow street just off the Strand, a short walk from Charing Cross, close enough to the Thames that on damp nights the air carries the smell of the river up between the buildings. 4 floors of dark brick, plain windows, a doorway that has been painted and repainted so many times that the wood beneath has forgotten its original shape. 36 Craven Street. Between the years 1757 and 1775, this was the London home of Benjamin Franklin. He lived here longer than he lived anywhere else in his adult life. He wrote here, he entertained here, he conducted experiments here that would eventually change the way the world understood electricity and lightning and the invisible forces that move through the air during a storm. And in 1998, during a restoration project meant to save the building from collapse, workers digging in a windowless basement room beneath the back of the house found something that nobody was expecting. Bones, not one skeleton, not a single forgotten burial. More than 1,200 fragments of human bone, packed into a pit roughly 1 metre wide, buried beneath the floor of a room that had no windows and only one door. The remains of at least 15 people, men, women, children. Some of the skulls had been drilled. Some of the long bones had been cut cleanly through with a saw. One was still lodged with the tip of a surgical instrument. The story you're about to hear begins with that discovery, which is entirely real and which you can read about in the published archaeological record. And then it goes somewhere else, somewhere the official record does not follow. Tonight, we're going down into the basement beneath Craven Street. We're going to walk through the verified history first, carefully, brick by brick, exactly as it was documented. And then we're going to step past the last page of that documentation into the version of the story that certain people insist was buried alongside those bones. So settle in, turn the lights low, let your shoulders drop away from your ears. You do not have to stay awake for the ending. You are listening to Sleep Theories. Now, let us begin where I began. With a phone call. My name is Nathaniel Cross. I am a forensic historian. That title means less than it sounds like. It means I spend most of my working life in cold rooms, in archives, in the basements of institutions that have run out of money, reading the handwriting of people who have been dead for 200 years and trying to work out which parts of what they wrote were true. I specialise in 18th century London. Specifically, I specialise in the parts of 18th century London that the 18th century preferred not to write down. Burial practices, anatomy schools, the trade in bodies, the quiet, practical arrangements that allowed a city of 700,000 people to dispose of its dead without ever quite explaining where they had gone. It is not glamorous work. It does not attract crowds. Which is why, on a Tuesday evening in late November, when my phone rang and the screen showed a number belonging to a small museum in central London, I assumed it was about a funding application. It was not about a funding application. The curator on the other end of the line was a woman I'd worked with twice before. She was careful. She was precise. She was the sort of person who chose her words the way a surgeon chooses instruments, and she was frightened. She did not say that. She never would have said that. But I had known her for 11 years, and there is a particular thinness that enters a careful person's voice when they're working very hard to sound calm. She asked whether I could come to Craven Street. Not tomorrow. Tonight. I asked what had happened. She said there had been a structural survey. The house is old, and old houses in London are always sinking, always shifting, always requiring some new intervention to keep them standing. Engineers had been checking the foundations beneath a storage room at the rear of the basement level. Routine work. The sort of work that produces a report nobody reads. They had found a void, a cavity behind the basement wall, sealed, unrecorded. Not on any plan, not in any survey, not in any of the extensive documentation that had been produced during the long restoration of the building in the late 1990s. She said the engineers had made a small opening to inspect it with a camera, and then they had stopped work entirely, and then someone had made the decision to call her instead of calling the press. She said the trustees wanted an expert to look at it before anyone else did. She said, and I remember this exactly, because of the strange formality of it, "Nathaniel, I would like you to see this while it is still quiet." I took the last train down. I remember the carriage was almost empty. I remember the rain on the window, the orange smear of the platform lights, the way the city arrived in pieces. I remember thinking that it was probably a cistern. That is the honest truth. On the train, I was already writing the boring version of the report in my head. 18th century houses in that part of London are riddled with sealed voids, old wells, filled coal chutes, drainage runs that were bricked over when the sewers came in, cavities that exist for the profoundly unmysterious reason that at some point, some builder found it cheaper to wall a space off than to fill it in. I have been called to a dozen mysterious voids in my career. 11 of them were cisterns. I want you to remember that I went down those stairs expecting nothing. It matters later that I was not looking for anything. The house at night is not the house you visit during the day. During opening hours, Benjamin Franklin House is a careful, gentle, well-managed place. There are volunteers, there is a soundtrack of period music. There is a performance that walks visitors through the rooms and tells them about the years Franklin spent here, and about the landlady, Margaret Stevenson, and about her daughter Polly, and about the strange domestic arrangement by which one of the most famous men in the Western world lived for nearly 2 decades in 4 rooms of a rented house on a side street. At night, with the lights off and the volunteers gone home, it is simply an old building holding its breath. The floors are original in places. They tell you where you're standing. There is a particular tone to the boards on the first floor landing, a low complaint that I could still identify today. The curator met me at the door with 2 engineers and a site manager. Nobody was making conversation. We went down through the house to the basement level, past the kitchen, past the panelled room, and into the back where the museum stores its overflow. Boxes of leaflets, folded display stands, a vacuum cleaner, the ordinary debris that accumulates in the parts of a historic building the public never enters. They had moved all of it into the corridor. The rear wall of that storage room had been opened in a rough rectangle about the size of a doorway. The brick around the opening was pale, powdery, crumbling at the edges the way old lime mortar does when it has been dry for a very long time. And here is the first thing I noticed, and the first thing that made the evening stop being ordinary. There were 2 walls, not a wall and a void behind it. 2 walls built separately, with a gap of about 40 centimetres between them. The outer wall, the one that formed the visible boundary of the storage room, was consistent with the rest of the basement. Same brick, same bond pattern, same mortar, entirely unremarkable. The inner wall was different brick, denser, better fired, more expensive, laid by someone who knew what they were doing and who was not in a hurry. And here is the detail that I could not stop looking at. The detail I kept returning to for weeks afterward. The inner wall had been rendered on the far side. You do not render a wall you intend to forget. Rendering is finishing. Rendering is a surface meant to be seen and cleaned and lived beside. Somebody had built a room down there, finished it properly, used it, and then, at some later point, walled it off from the world with a second, cheaper wall built specifically to hide the first. The engineers had already told the curator that the cavity extended further back than their camera could resolve. They had also told her that the air inside had been still for a very long time. I asked when we could open it. The site manager looked at the curator looked at me, and there was a pause in that room, a real pause, in which I think all of us understood that we were standing on the last edge of the version of history that we already knew. Then the site manager said, "We can have the rest of it down in about an hour." It took nearer to 2. They worked slowly because the wall was load-bearing at the top and nobody wanted the ceiling of a Grade 1 listed building coming down on them at midnight, brick by brick. Each one lifted out and set on a pallet. The mortar came away almost like dust. I want to describe the moment the last course came out, because I have described it to almost nobody, and because I still do not entirely trust my own memory of it. The room exhaled. That is the only honest way I can put it. There was a pressure difference, a real one, physical and measurable and utterly explicable, and cold air moved out of that opening and across my face and into the storage room, and it smelled of stone and iron and something faintly sweet underneath. 240 years of held breath. One of the engineers laughed. It was a short, embarrassed sound, the noise a person makes when their body has reacted before their mind has caught up. Nobody laughed after that. We put the lamp through first. The chamber was about 5 meters by 4, low ceiling, brick vault overhead, which told me it was original to the house or very close to it. Stone flags on the floor laid tight, worn smooth in a path that ran from the doorway to the centre of the room and nowhere else. That path was the second thing that frightened me. Stone wears where feet go. A path worn into flagstones is not made by one visit or 10. It is made by the same journey, repeated, by many people, over many years. Somebody had walked from that door to that spot in the middle of the room enough times to polish the stone. And in the middle of the room, at the end of the path, was a chair. It was a heavy piece of furniture. Oak, I thought, and I was later proved right. High-backed, broad-armed, made without ornament of any kind, which is itself unusual for the period, because 18th century furniture of that quality almost always carries some small vanity, some carved edge or shaped foot where the maker signed his work with his taste. This had none. It had been built the way a workbench is built, for a purpose. There were iron fittings at the wrists. There were iron fittings at the ankles. There was a broad hinged band at the chest, and the hinge still moved when I touched it, and that was the moment my hand started shaking, because a hinge that still moves after 2 centuries has been maintained. Somebody had oiled that iron. Around the chair, arranged along the walls, was everything else. There was a bench running the length of the left-hand wall, and on it, laid out in an order that had clearly meant something to whoever left them, were instruments, brass mostly, some steel. I recognised perhaps half of them on sight: electrometers, a pithball apparatus, 2 Leyden jars which are glass containers lined inside and out with metal foil, capable of holding a static charge, and which in the 1700s were the closest thing the world had to a battery. I recognised the rest of them later, from drawings. There were glass vessels on the bench too, and several of them had been scorched. Not broken. Scorched on the inside in a pattern that spidered up the walls of the glass and stopped near the rim. There were notebooks. There was a shelf on the rear wall, running the full width of the chamber, and on that shelf were skulls. I counted 28. I counted them 3 times because the first count did not seem like a real number, and the second count I did not trust, and the third count I performed out loud with the curator standing behind me writing it down. 28. They were clean, prepared, handled with skill. Whoever had processed them had known what they were doing, and had taken care, and that is the part that I have never been able to make peace with, because carelessness would have been easier to understand. Each skull sat on a small wooden block. Each block was numbered, and the numbers ran in sequence, and the sequence had no gaps, and each skull had been engraved, not the block. The bone itself, a tiny mark cut into the frontal bone above the left eye socket, no more than a centimetre across. My first thought was initials. That would have been ordinary. Anatomists in that era did label specimens, sometimes crudely, and initials would have told us something about provenance without telling us anything alarming. They were not initials, they were numbers. 2 groups of numbers separated by a small incised line, each group carried to 3 decimal places. I stood in that cold room at 1 in the morning, with rain moving somewhere far above us on the roof of a house in central London, and I read the marks on the 3rd skull from the left, and I felt the floor of my understanding give way beneath me. They were coordinates, latitude and longitude expressed in decimal degrees, and that is not possible. I need you to understand why that is not possible, because everything that follows in this story depends on it. Latitude in the 1700s was solvable. A skilled navigator could take a sighting of the sun at noon and calculate his latitude with reasonable confidence. That had been achievable for centuries. Longitude was the great unsolved problem of the age. Nations offered fortunes for a solution. Ships were lost, routinely, catastrophically, because a captain could not determine how far east or west he had travelled. John Harrison spent his life building the marine chronometers that eventually solved it, and his fourth timekeeper was tested at sea in 1761, and even then the practical use of that method spread slowly and unevenly for decades. But the deeper problem is not the measurement. The deeper problem is the notation. Decimal degrees, written to 3 decimal places expressed as a pair, is a modern convention. In the 18th century you would have written a position in degrees, minutes and seconds. That is how every chart of that period is marked. That is how every logbook is kept. That is how every single surviving navigational document of the era expresses a location on the surface of the Earth. Nobody in 1770 wrote a position the way it was written on those skulls. I photographed every mark. I did it badly, with my phone, with my hands unsteady, and those photographs are the only reason I'm still confident that any of it happened at all. Later, at home, in daylight, with a proper map, I began plotting them. But I'm getting ahead of myself, because before I understood what the chamber was, I had to understand what the house had already been accused of. Let us leave the chamber for a while. It has waited 240 years. It can wait a little longer. I want to walk you through the documented history now, because the documented history is genuinely strange on its own, and because you cannot see where the seam is unless you know what the fabric was supposed to look like. Benjamin Franklin arrived in London in the summer of 1757. He was 51 years old. He came as an agent for the Pennsylvania Assembly, sent across the Atlantic to argue a colonial grievance before the British government, and he expected to stay for a few months. He stayed, on and off, for the better part of 18 years. He took lodgings at 36 Craven Street, in the house of a widow named Margaret Stevenson. He had 4 rooms. He had his son William with him at first, and 2 enslaved men, Peter and King, a fact that the polite version of this story tends to move past quickly, and which deserves to be said plainly. And over the following years that house became something remarkable. Franklin was not simply a colonial agent. By the time he arrived in London, he was already one of the most famous scientific minds in the world. His experiments with electricity had been published in 1751. The kite experiment, whatever its precise details, had made his name across Europe. The Royal Society had awarded him the Copley Medal in 1753, its highest honour, before he had ever set foot in their building as a fellow. So the house filled with people, fellows of the Royal Society, instrument makers from Fleet Street, physicians, chemists, political men who wanted a quiet room in which to say something they could not say in Parliament, the great Scottish anatomists, Priestley, who would isolate oxygen, members of the Lunar Society when they came south. 36 Craven Street was, for roughly 2 decades, one of the most intellectually dense addresses in Europe, and it was a rented lodging house on a side street, and almost nobody today knows it exists. Now hold that fact in your hand for a moment, because the conspiracy version of this story does not begin by claiming that anything about the house was false. It begins by pointing out that all of it was true and asking a single question about it. If you wanted a room in the middle of London where the finest experimental minds in the world could come and go at all hours, carrying equipment, staying late, arriving separately, being seen by nobody who would think it worth remarking on, where would you put it? You would put it exactly there. You would put it in the private residence of a beloved public scientist, in a house full of legitimate visitors, on a street that led nowhere in particular, 4 minutes from the river. The reputation was not the cover story. The reputation was the architecture. That is the conspiracy's first move, and I want to flag it clearly, because it is a very good move and it is doing something subtle. It takes a set of entirely verified facts and redescribes their purpose. Nothing has been added, nothing has been falsified, the evidence is identical, only the direction of causation has been quietly reversed. Keep watching for that. It happens again. And then, in 1772, a man moved into the house who changes the shape of everything. His name was William Hewson. William Hewson deserves to be better known than he is. He was born in Northumberland in 1739, the son of a surgeon. He trained in Newcastle, then in London, then in Edinburgh, which at that time was arguably the finest medical school in the world. He came back to London and went to work with the Hunter brothers, William and John, who were the towering figures of British anatomy, and who were, between them, transforming surgery from a trade into a science. Hewson was brilliant. Not merely competent, brilliant. He conducted the foundational research on the lymphatic system, tracing vessels that his predecessors had not been able to follow. He identified the role of what we now call fibrinogen in the clotting of blood. He described red blood cells with an accuracy that would not be improved upon for generations, correcting the shape that earlier microscopists had assumed. He was elected a Fellow of the Royal Society at the age of 30 and awarded the Copley Medal, the same medal Franklin had received in 1769. He was, by any reasonable measure, one of the most important scientists in England, and in 1771 he married Mary Stevenson. Polly, everyone called her. She was the daughter of Franklin's landlady. She'd grown up in and around that house. Franklin adored her. In the complicated, avuncular, faintly possessive way he adored a number of clever young women, and he had corresponded with her for years about science and philosophy and the education of her mind. So when Polly Stevenson married William Hewson, the anatomist did not simply become a family friend. He moved in. The Hewsons took the house at 36 Craven Street. Margaret Stevenson moved to another property. Franklin stayed in his rooms, and in that house, William Hewson opened an anatomy school. This is the crucial documented fact, and I want to be extremely clear about it, because it is the foundation of the official explanation for everything that was later found in that basement. Private anatomy schools were legal and common and central to medical education in 18th century London. The problem was that the supply of legal cadavers was almost non-existent. Under the law, the only bodies available for dissection were those of executed murderers, and the number of executed murderers, even in the age of the Bloody Code, was nowhere near the number of bodies required to teach anatomy to hundreds of students each year. So the schools bought bodies from resurrection men, grave robbers, men who worked the burial grounds of the poor and delivered their harvest by night, and who were paid well, and who were not asked questions. 36 Craven Street sits close to the river. There was a wharf at the end of the street in that period. Bodies could be brought up from a boat, into a back door, down into a basement, without ever crossing a lit thoroughfare. Hewson taught there from about 1772. He dissected there. He demonstrated there. His students, perhaps 30 or 40 at a time, worked on human remains in that building, and then, in 1774, he cut himself during a dissection. The wound became infected. There was no treatment. Septicemia killed him within days. William Hewson died on the 1st of May, 1774, at the age of 34 in a house on Craven Street, leaving a pregnant wife, 2 small children, and an anatomy school with no anatomist. That is the historical record. Every word of it is documented, published, and verifiable, and it explains the bones. It explains them completely, in fact. When the pit was excavated in the late 1990s, the assemblage was exactly what you would expect from a teaching anatomy school of that era. Bones from many individuals, mixed. Saw marks consistent with demonstration. Skulls with trepanation, which is drilling, consistent with surgical practice. Cut marks made by skilled hands. Radiocarbon dating and the physical stratigraphy both placed the deposit in the correct window. Buttons and pins and pottery from the period were mixed through the fill. The conclusion of the archaeological team was straightforward, well supported, and almost certainly correct. The remains beneath Benjamin Franklin's house were the discarded material of William Hewson's anatomy school, buried in the basement because burying them was safer than being caught carrying them out. That is the answer. I have spent my career defending answers like that one against people who prefer stories. And I want you to hear me say clearly before we go any further, I still think that answer is correct. The trouble is that it is an answer to a question about a pit in the front basement. It is not an answer to a question about a sealed chamber at the back that no one knew existed, containing a chair with restraints and 28 prepared skulls, and coordinates written in a notation that would not be invented for another 100 years. The notebooks were on the bench, under a folded square of oiled leather, and the leather had done its work. The paper was dry, brittle at the edges, foxed brown in patches, but legible. There were 4 of them. 3 were technical, columns of figures, dates, times, measurements in units I had to look up because they were not standard even for the period. Somebody had been recording something over a span of years, and recording it methodically, and the discipline of it was the most disturbing thing about it. The 4th notebook was different. It was smaller, bound in dark calf, and it was tucked into a shallow recess beneath the seat of the chair. I found it because I had knelt down to examine the mechanism of the ankle restraint, and my hand found the gap. It was a journal, written in a single hand in English, in a script that was educated but hurried, and the author never signed a name. Every entry ends the same way, a single letter. Hey, I have had that handwriting examined by 3 people I trust, independently, without telling any of them what the others had said. It is not Benjamin Franklin. It is nothing like Benjamin Franklin, whose hand is famously round and confident and consistent from youth to old age. It is not William Hewson. We have a substantial amount of Hewson's writing, and the letter forms do not match. It is not Polly Stevenson, or Margaret Stevenson, or William Franklin, or any of the household servants for whom we have samples. Whoever A was, they were in that room, and they were educated, and they left no trace anywhere else in the surviving record of that house. The entries describe meetings. They are dated mostly. They span from the winter of 1762 to the autumn of 1774, which is a period of 12 years, and which ends 5 months after William Hewson died. They describe a gathering that met in that chamber, not every week, sometimes twice in a month, sometimes not for half a year. The attendance is recorded by initials and by profession: physicians, natural philosophers, 2 instrument makers, a man described only as of the House, which in the language of the period almost certainly means a member of Parliament. There is no reference anywhere in the journal to the Royal Society, which is remarkable, because these were, by their descriptions, exactly the sort of men who would have been fellows of it. And one sentence recurs. It appears first in the 3rd entry. It appears by my count 41 times across 12 years, sometimes as a heading, sometimes at the close of a session. Once on a page that is otherwise blank, written 3 times in a column as if the writer were trying to make himself believe it. The current remains after death, now. I want to be careful here, because this is the point at which a responsible historian is obliged to slow down. There is nothing supernatural about that sentence in its own century. The mid-1700s was the great age of electrical enthusiasm. Electricity had arrived as a genuine wonder, and nobody yet knew what it was. It was invisible. It moved instantly. It could be stored in a jar, released at will, made to leap across a gap with a crack and a flash. It killed. It also sometimes revived, and critically, it made dead tissue move. Take a freshly killed frog, apply a charge to the nerve, and the leg kicks. Every natural philosopher in Europe had seen that demonstration. Luigi Galvani would formalise the study of it in Italy, and his nephew Giovanni Aldini would take it on tour, and in the early 1800s Aldini would apply electricity to the corpse of an executed murderer at the Royal College of Surgeons in London, and make the body's eye open and its fist clench in front of a horrified audience. That was not fringe. That was mainstream experimental science, performed in public, reported in journals, and Benjamin Franklin was at the centre of it. Franklin killed birds with electricity to study the effect. He electrocuted a turkey and reported dryly that he had intended to kill it, and had very nearly killed himself instead, and that the flash and the crack were considerable, and that he felt the shock in the back of his neck for some time afterward. Franklin treated paralysis with electricity. He administered shocks to patients who had lost the use of their limbs at their request, and recorded the results, and was honest enough to note that the improvement usually faded, and that he suspected the patients were being helped more by hope than by current. Franklin, along with others, was interested in the resuscitation of the drowned. This was a live question in a port city. The Royal Humane Society was founded in London in 1774, in Franklin's time there, specifically to promote the recovery of people pulled from the water who appeared to be dead, and its methods included, among other things, electrical stimulation. So when a journal from that basement says the current remains after death, the ordinary reading is that a group of serious men were investigating post-mortem electrical response in tissue, which is precisely what serious men of that era did investigate. There is nothing to see here, except that I have read all 4 notebooks now, several times, and the technical volumes are not recording tissue response. They're recording something that has a duration and a decay curve, and that the writer refers to again and again, not as a reaction, as a signal. Here is the passage from the real historical record that I cannot stop thinking about. In 1773, Benjamin Franklin wrote a letter to a French physician named Jacques Barbeau du Bourg. It is a well-known letter. It has been reprinted many times. In it, Franklin describes an observation he says he made concerning flies that had been drowned in a bottle of Madeira wine shipped from Virginia. Poured out into the sun, he wrote, some of the drowned flies dried, stirred, and eventually flew away. And then Franklin writes the sentence that has haunted 3 centuries of readers. He says that he wishes it were possible to invent a method of embalming drowned persons in such a manner that they might be recalled to life at any period, however distant. He says that, having a very ardent desire to see and observe the state of America 100 years hence, he would prefer to an ordinary death being immersed in a cask of Madeira wine with a few friends until that time, and then to be recalled to life by the solar warmth of his dear country. He adds, with the sigh you can hear from here, that in all probability he lives in a century too little advanced and too near the infancy of science to see such an art brought in his own time to its perfection. That is real. You can read it tonight. Most historians treat it as a joke, a wry, characteristic, half-serious flourish from a man who joked about everything, including his own funeral. I have always treated it as a joke too. The journal beneath the chair treats it as a policy statement. Entry after entry returns to the premise, and the premise is this. When a body dies, the machinery stops, but the machinery is not the thing they were interested in. What interested them was the pattern the machinery had been carrying. The writer, A, puts it in 18th century terms, and I will read you their phrasing as closely as I can render it, because the original is convoluted and full of abbreviations. They say, the body is the instrument, and the current is the music, and when the player stands up from the instrument, the music does not cease at once, but persists in the room a while, growing fainter, until the room forgets it. That is not a mechanical claim. That is not a claim about muscle twitch. That is a claim that the electrical activity of a living brain is a pattern, that the pattern is unique to the individual, and that the pattern persists in some detectable form for a period after clinical death. And here is the part that unsettles me as a historian more than anything else in that chamber, more than the chair, more than the restraints. That is not a stupid idea. It is wrong, almost certainly in the form they meant it. But the underlying intuition that the brain has measurable electrical activity, that this activity has structure, that it can in principle be recorded from outside the skull, that its cessation is gradual rather than instantaneous, is broadly correct. And it was not demonstrated until Richard Caton recorded electrical activity from animal brains in the 1870s, and it was not achieved in humans until Hans Berger made the first human recording in the 1920s. The men in that basement were reaching, in 1768, for something that would take science another 150 years to touch. and that is either an extraordinary coincidence of intuition, or they had a reason to believe it that we do not have. The journal numbers its major sessions. They are not experiments in the modern sense, with controls and hypotheses. They are demonstrations. Each one is given a number and a date, and each one is described in a page or two of dense, technical, curiously flat prose. Demonstration 1 is dated the 9th of February 1763. It involves a recently slaughtered pig and a Leyden jar, and the result is described as within expectation. Demonstrations 2 through 9 are variations. Different animals, different intervals after death, different arrangements of conductor and jar. The writer records that the response weakens as the interval lengthens, and that it is essentially absent beyond a certain number of minutes, and the number varies, and the variation frustrates them. Demonstration 10 is the first that mentions a human subject, and I want to be careful about how I say this, because the journal is careful about how it says it. It says, of the 10th of November, 1765, that the subject was procured through the usual arrangement, that the interval was under 1 hour, and that the subject was female and of no established connection. Of no established connection. That phrase appears in the journal 14 times. It is the language of the resurrection trade. It means a person nobody would look for. It means the poor, the unclaimed, the workhouse dead, the ones whose graves were shallow, and whose families could not afford the iron cage that wealthier people bought to protect their dead from the men with shovels. It means these were bodies that the 18th century had already decided did not count, and the men in that chamber were using a phrase to make sure they did not have to think about it. I have read a great many documents from the anatomy trade. That phrase is not standard. Somebody invented it deliberately for this journal. The demonstrations continue. 11 through 20 span 9 years. The apparatus grows more elaborate. The intervals shrink, which means they were getting their subjects faster, which means the arrangement was becoming more efficient, which is a thought I have tried not to follow all the way to its end. And then there is Demonstration 21. It is dated the 4th of March, 1772. It is the only entry in the journal that has a title. The title is written in a larger hand across the top of the page, and it says simply, "The First Return." The entry begins normally. The apparatus is described. The room is described. The attendance is unusually high, 11 present, which is more than any other session. The interval is recorded as under 20 minutes, which is the shortest in the entire journal. The subject is recorded as of no established connection, and then the writer describes the arrangement, and the arrangement is different from every session before it, because for the first time the apparatus is not simply delivering a charge, it is listening. They had built something to read. The writer describes an array of coils, a suspended needle, a lamp arranged behind a screen so that the smallest movement of the needle would be magnified as a moving shadow on the wall of the chamber. This is not an absurd design. It is essentially a mirror galvanometer, and instruments of that general kind were genuinely used to detect very small currents in the following century. They were trying to see something too faint to feel. The writer records that the room was darkened, that the charge was applied, that the shadow on the wall moved as expected and returned as expected, and then, 40 seconds later, with no charge applied and no hand on the apparatus, it moved again. The writer records that it moved 3 times. The writer records the interval between the movements, 4 seconds, 4 seconds, 4 seconds. The writer records that a physician present, whose initials are given, asked a question aloud. And then the page ends, and the next 4 pages have been cut out, not torn. Cut with a blade close to the binding cleanly, by someone who wanted the volume to remain usable. The journal resumes with a 20-second demonstration, dated 11 months later, and the tone of the writing has changed completely. It is shorter, it is colder, it uses the passive voice in places where it previously used the first-person plural. And in the margin of that first page after the gap, in the same hand, smaller, is a line that is not part of the record of the session. It says, "We did not consider that it might answer." I spent the following 4 months in archives. That is the unglamorous heart of this work, not torchlight and cellars, reading rooms, request slips, gloves, the particular ache that settles into your shoulders after the 6th hour of transcribing a hand you cannot quite read. I had a list of initials from the journal, and I set out to identify the members. Some were easy. The instrument makers were traceable through trade directories and through the Royal Society's purchasing records, and both of the men I identified were real, and both made electrical apparatus, and both had documented business with Franklin. The physicians were harder, but not impossible. I matched 4 of the sets of initials to men who were licensed in London during the correct period, whose practices were within walking distance, and whose published interests overlapped almost exactly with the content of the demonstrations. And then I hit the wall. There are, in that journal, 7 sets of initials that I could not attach to any living person. That in itself is not extraordinary. The 18th century swallowed people. Records burn. Parish registers go missing. What is extraordinary is what I found instead. 3 of the 7 matched precisely men who had died before the meetings they were recorded as attending. Let me be specific, without giving you the actual names, because 2 of those families still exist and I have already caused them enough distress. One is recorded as present at 4 sessions between 1766 and 1770. He was a physician of some standing. His will was proved in 1764. There is a monument to him in a church in Hertfordshire with his death date carved into it. I have stood in front of it. Another is recorded as present at a single session in 1769. His death is documented in 1762 at sea, in a well-attested incident with multiple surviving accounts. The third is the one I cannot let go of. He is recorded 11 times, across the full span of the journal, more often than almost anyone. And the only man in London with those initials and that stated profession in that period died in 1759, 3 years before the journal begins. Now. I am a historian, and I want to give you the boring explanations first, because they are almost certainly the correct ones, and because I do not think you should take my word for anything. Initials are ambiguous. There were tens of thousands of men in London, and only 26 letters, and a single set of initials with a profession attached is thin evidence at the best of times. Journals are unreliable. Attendance may have been recorded from memory days later wrongly. The dates may be wrong. Datelines in 18th century documents are inconsistent, and Britain had only changed calendars in 1752, and confusion about the year persisted for decades. And the simplest explanation of all, which I believe on most days, the journal is a fabrication. It is not a record of what happened. It is a record designed to look like something, produced by someone for a purpose, perhaps decades after the events it claims to describe. Any one of those explanations dissolves the mystery entirely. But here is what the conspiracy version says, and I am obliged to tell you, because you did not come here for the boring explanation. The conspiracy says the names are not errors. It says the journal was recording attendance accurately, and that some of those attending had died, and that being dead was not, within that chamber, considered a disqualification from attendance. It says that is what the demonstrations were for, and it says that this is the reason the group was never part of the Royal Society, never published, never claimed a discovery, never sought the priority that 18th century natural philosophers fought over like dogs, because they were not a scientific body. The journal gives them a name. It appears only twice, and both times in the earliest entries, as though the writer stopped using it once the habit of secrecy set in. They called themselves the Society of the Returning Spark. The obvious question is why Franklin? The conspiracy's answer is elegant, and I dislike how elegant it is. The ordinary assumption is that a secret group would recruit a famous man because his fame was useful. Access, protection, money. The journal implies the opposite sequence. There are 3 entries, all early, all before 1765, in which the writer refers to the American, and refers to him not as a member, but as an instrument. In one, the writer notes that the American's public work proceeds well, and that the enthusiasm of the continent for his lightning is greatly to our advantage. Greatly to our advantage. The conspiracy reads that as follows. Franklin's public electrical work was not a hobby that happened to coexist with the private work. It was the front of the private work. Every lecture, every demonstration, every published letter about kites and rods and jars did two things at once. It advanced human knowledge genuinely and enormously, and it made the presence of electrical apparatus in that house completely unremarkable. If a neighbour on Craven Street noticed crates of glass and brass being carried down to the basement at odd hours, the neighbour thought, "That is Dr. Franklin and his lightning." If a servant heard a crack and saw a flash under the door, the servant thought, "That is Dr. Franklin and his lightning." If a member of Parliament was seen entering a lodging house on a side street at 11 at night, the explanation was already prepared, and it was true, and it was the greatest cover story ever accidentally constructed, because it was not constructed at all. It grew. The lightning rod, in this reading, is not a metaphor. It is the operating principle. You give the world something bright and loud and high above the house, and everything happening in the basement passes safely into the ground. And there is a second layer to this, which the journal touches on only once, and which I find harder to dismiss than I would like. Franklin, in the documented historical record, was extraordinarily concerned with his own papers. He organised them, he copied them, he worried, in letters, about their fate. And at his death in 1790, an enormous quantity of his correspondence and manuscripts went missing. This is not a fringe claim. It is a standing problem in Franklin's scholarship. His papers were dispersed after his death, ended up in multiple hands, and a substantial body of material vanished. Some resurfaced decades later in improbable circumstances. A quantity of his papers is said to have been found generations after his death in a tailor's shop in London, where they were being used to cut patterns from. Historians treat this as ordinary chaos. Estates are messy, executors are careless, paper was valuable and reused. The conspiracy treats it as a clean-up, and it points out correctly that the gap in the surviving record is not random. The years for which Franklin's papers are thinnest are the London years, the Craven Street years, the years covered by the journal. Now, I want to say something here as clearly as I can. Absence of evidence is the favourite food of every conspiracy theory ever constructed. A gap in a record can be made to mean anything, because a gap has no shape of its own, and the human mind will pour whatever it is carrying into any empty container it finds. The papers are missing because paper burns, and executors are lazy, and 230 years is a long time. That is what I would say in a lecture. That is what I would say to a colleague. That is what I said to myself for 4 months while I sat in reading rooms and tried to explain 28 numbered skulls. Let us go back to the numbers, because the numbers are where this stops being a story about atmosphere and starts being a story about arithmetic. The excavation in the front basement, the one everybody knows about, produced remains that were assessed as representing a minimum of 15 individuals. That figure is a minimum. It is calculated the way all such figures are calculated, by counting duplicated elements. If you have 16 left femurs, you have at least 16 people. It is a floor, not a ceiling, and the true number is always higher and usually unknowable. The journal describes 28 demonstrations. The shelf in the sealed chamber holds 28 skulls. Those two 28s are the reason I could not walk away. Because if the chamber were simply an overflow store from Houston's teaching school, the numbers would not agree. Teaching material accumulates chaotically. You would expect a jumble, a bin, a mixed deposit of whatever was left at the end of a term. Instead, there is a one-to-one correspondence between a written record of events and a physical inventory of remains, maintained across 12 years, numbered without gaps, arranged in order. That is not a store. That is a set. And there is a further problem, which is the one that keeps me awake, and I have to explain a little archaeology to make it land. When the pit in the front basement was excavated, the assemblage was, as I said, exactly consistent with an anatomy school. But there was a note in the technical report, a single line in a section about skeletal representation that almost nobody has ever remarked upon. The report observed that certain elements were underrepresented relative to what would be expected, specifically that there were fewer cranial remains than the number of individuals would predict. In an anatomy school deposit, skulls should be well represented. They are the most studied element. They are the most frequently prepared. They are also, and this matters, the most valuable, which is why some go missing to private collections. The report noted the shortfall and offered exactly that explanation. Collectors, souvenirs, the ordinary attrition of 200 years. I read that line for the first time on a Thursday afternoon in a reading room, having read it a dozen times before in my career without ever thinking about it for more than a second. And then I thought about a shelf. 28 skulls, prepared and numbered and kept, in a sealed room 40 centimetres behind a wall, while the rest of the bodies went into a pit in the front basement, where anyone digging a drain in 100 years would find them. That is the piece I cannot fit into the ordinary explanation. Because if you are simply disposing of teaching waste, you dispose of it all in the same hole. Somebody separated the heads. Somebody carried them into a different room, cleaned them, numbered them, engraved them, arranged them in sequence, and then built a wall. It took the laboratory 3 weeks to come back to me about the teeth. I had noticed it on the second night, and I had assumed it meant nothing, and I had submitted samples mostly to be thorough. Every skull on that shelf was missing exactly one tooth, the same tooth, the second molar, lower left. In all 28, every other tooth present and accounted for in most cases, allowing for the ordinary catastrophe of 18th century dentistry. Wear, decay, abscess. The population of Georgian London had appalling teeth, and their skulls show it. But the second lower left molar was gone from every single one, and in every case the socket was intact and undamaged, which means the tooth was not lost in life and did not fall out in the ground. It was extracted after death, with care, by someone who did not want to break the jaw. My first assumption was ritual. That is the reflex, and it is usually wrong, and it was wrong here. Ritual practices leave a wider signature. You would expect other modifications, other patterns, some variation across time as the practice drifted. My second assumption was collection, that someone had wanted a token from each subject. The laboratory report ruled out both. Under magnification, the interior of every socket showed the same feature. Small areas of altered bone focal on the walls of the socket, with a texture that the report described as consistent with localized thermal alteration, burning, inside the tooth socket, in a very small, very precise area. The report was cautious about it, as good reports are. It offered alternative explanations, post-depositional staining, fungal action, chemical alteration from something in the fill. But the pattern was identical in all 28, and identical patterns do not come from random processes. So I sat down with an anatomist and asked her a simple question. If someone in the 1700s wanted to introduce a conductor into a human head and wanted the shortest, most direct route to a major nerve trunk without opening the skull, where would they go? She thought about it for less than 5 seconds. She said, the inferior alveolar nerve. It runs through the mandible. It carries sensation from the lower teeth. And the socket of a lower molar sits directly above it, separated by a thin shell of bone that a determined person with a fine instrument could pass through in a matter of minutes. It is, she said, essentially a doorway. Modern dentistry uses that same anatomy every day, from the other direction, to deliver anaesthetic. They were not collecting teeth. They were making an access point, and that reframes everything, because it means the demonstrations were not surface applications. They were not putting a charge across a corpse and watching a limb jump, which is what everybody in Europe was doing and which explains nothing unusual at all. They were placing a conductor into direct contact with the peripheral nervous system and running it inward toward the base of the skull. They were trying to reach the brain from the inside. The report also gave me the one piece of information I had asked for without expecting an answer, and it is the piece I have never published, and the reason I have never published it is that I do not have a good explanation for how anyone would have known to do it. The alteration in every socket was on the same wall. The medial wall, the one closest to the midline of the body, which is the correct side, which is where the nerve actually runs. Somebody in that basement, decades before the nervous system was mapped in anything like modern terms, knew precisely where to aim. I went back into the chamber alone, in February, with permission that I am fairly sure the curator did not have the authority to give me. I wanted the floor. The path worn into the flagstones had been bothering me since the first night, because it ran from the door to the chair and stopped there, and that made sense. But there was a second, fainter wear pattern that ran from the chair toward the rear left corner, and then stopped at nothing. A worn path that leads to a blank wall means that the wall was not always blank. I lifted 3 flagstones. It took most of an afternoon. Under the third one, set into the packed earth and covered with a slab of slate, was a lead-lined box about the size of a folio volume. Inside it was a single sheet of paper, folded twice, and nothing else. The paper is heavy-laid stock with a watermark I have traced to a Kentish mill operating in that period. The ink is iron gall, standard for the era, and its degradation pattern is consistent with age. It is unsigned. It is addressed, in a line across the top, to whoever opens this room. And the handwriting is Benjamin Franklin's. I have had it examined by 2 document specialists. Neither knew the provenance. Both said the same thing in different words. The letter forms, the spacing, the characteristic terminals, the way the writer joins certain pairs, all consistent with authenticated Franklin exemplars from the 1770s. Neither would state it as a certainty, because no responsible examiner ever does. Both said it is either his hand or the work of a forger of remarkable skill and remarkable patience who buried their forgery under a flagstone in a room that had been sealed for over 2 centuries and would not be opened in their lifetime, or in their children's, or in anyone's they could have imagined. I will read you what it says. I have the transcription in front of me. I've modernised the spelling but changed nothing else. It begins without greeting. If this room has been opened, then the wall has failed, and I am long past caring what is said of me. We began in the belief that we were studying the animation of matter. That was the whole of our ambition. We wished to know by what agency the living differ from the dead, and we supposed the answer to be a species of fire, and we supposed that a sufficient understanding of that fire would place the recovery of the drowned and the strangled, and the newly fallen within the reach of ordinary practice. That was a good ambition. I hold to it still. Many will be saved by it. But we did not find a fire. We sought to understand life. Instead, we discovered memory. And then there is a gap of 2 lines, and the hand becomes smaller and more crowded, and the letter continues. I set down here what I have not written elsewhere and shall not. Every living creature carries in itself a current, and the current is not uniform, and its irregularities are not noise but signature. Each is particular. Each differs from every other as one face differs from another. I have satisfied myself of this beyond the reach of doubt. At the ceasing of the body, this current does not extinguish as a flame is snuffed. It diminishes. There is an interval. In that interval the signature persists, growing weaker, and it may be detected, and being detected it may be disturbed, and a thing that may be disturbed may be addressed. We addressed it. I record no more of that here. Those who are present require no reminder, and those who are not are better served by ignorance. I say only this. We had believed we would find, at the end of a man, an absence. We found instead a diminishing, and we had not asked ourselves before we began what obligation is owed to a diminishing thing, nor what such a thing might want, nor whether the asking of a question is a kindness. I am an old man now, and I have made a study of my errors, and this is the greatest of them. Seal the room. Do not repeat the 21st. If you are of a scientific temper and cannot be persuaded, then I ask only that you begin as we did not, by determining first who it is that you are calling. Determine first who it is that you are calling. I had been carrying the coordinates around for months by then. I had plotted them the week after the chamber was opened, on a laptop at my kitchen table, expecting nothing, and I had not known what to do with the result, and so I had done what people do with results they cannot use. I'd put them in a folder and stopped looking at them. 28 pairs. Latitude and longitude, decimal degrees, 3 places. 27 of them fall within Greater London. They are spread across the city, north and south of the river, with a slight concentration to the east. They do not form a shape. They do not spell anything. They do not sit on a ley line or a grid or any of the other patterns that people find when they want to find patterns, and I checked, because I am not immune to wanting. They sit on burial grounds, not the great ones, not the cathedrals or the fashionable churchyards where merchants bought their vaults. They sit on the burial grounds of the poor, the overflow yards, the plague pits reopened for parish use, the unconsecrated corners where the workhouse dead and the drowned and the unnamed were put into the ground 4 deep because there was nowhere else to put them. Several of the locations are now buildings. 2 are under a railway, 1 is a car park, 1 is a small public garden with a bench in it, and I have sat on that bench, and there is nothing there, and there was never anything there, and 500,000 people walk past it every year. Every one of those sites was in use during the period covered by the journal. Now here is where the ordinary explanation still works, and I want to give it to you fairly. If you are running an anatomy operation supplied by resurrection men, you would want to keep a record of where your material came from. It would be practical. It would tell you which grounds were productive and which were guarded. It would be, in the coldest possible sense, inventory management. That explains 27 marks perfectly. It does not explain the notation, which is wrong for the century by 100 years, and it does not explain the 28th. The 28th skull sits at the end of the shelf. It is the largest. It is the only one with any damage, a healed fracture above the right orbit from some injury years before death. Its coordinates are not a burial ground. They are 36 Craven Street, to 3 decimal places, which at that latitude is a resolution of roughly 100 metres. They are the house, not the street, not the parish, the building we were standing in. I have checked that against every historical map I can find, and there is no burial ground at that location, and there never was, because the land is reclaimed river frontage that was not built on until the 1600s, and was open water before that. So here is the conspiracy's final claim, and it is the one that I have not been able to argue my way out of at 3 a.m. It says the marks are not labels. It says the marks are answers. It says the men in that chamber over 12 years refined a method until they were able to put a question to something that persisted for a few minutes after the death of a body, and that the question they eventually learned to ask was the simplest one available, the one you ask a person you cannot see. Where are you? And it says that 27 times they received in reply a position corresponding to a hole in the ground in London where a body had been left, and that they engraved it on the skull because they had no other way to file it. And it says that on the 28th attempt, the 4th of March, 1772, the demonstration they title The First Return, something answered that did not give the location of a grave. It gave the location of the room, which is not an answer to where are you. It is an answer to how close am I. William Hewson died on the 1st of May, 1774. The journal records demonstration 28, its last, on the 19th of October of that year, and then it stops, not with a conclusion, not with a summary. The remaining pages of the volume are blank, and the blankness of them is somehow worse than an ending would have been. Benjamin Franklin left London in March of 1775. He left in a hurry, and for entirely documented reasons, because the political situation between Britain and the American colonies had collapsed, and he had been publicly humiliated in the cockpit at Whitehall the previous year, standing silent for an hour while the Solicitor General tore into him in front of an audience of laughing lords. He sailed for Philadelphia. Within weeks of his arrival, the shooting had started at Lexington and Concord. He never came back to Craven Street. The house passed to other tenants. Polly Hewson stayed in touch with Franklin for the rest of his life, and eventually moved to America to be near him, and was with him when he died in 1790. And in the years between, according to the conspiracy, the room was closed. There is a documented event that the theory attaches itself to, and I want to describe it accurately. Franklin's papers, as I mentioned, were dispersed after his death, and a considerable body of manuscript material has never been recovered. That is a real and long-standing problem in the scholarship. There is also a documented fire. In 1812, a warehouse fire in London destroyed a quantity of stored papers belonging to an estate connected, at a distance, to one of Franklin's London associates. This is a real event with a real record. Insurance documents survive. The contents are described only in general terms, as is normal. The conspiracy says the papers were not lost. It says the society, or what remained of it, spent 40 years retrieving what had been written and destroying it, and that the fire was the end of that process rather than an accident within it, and that the last act was to build a second wall in a basement on Craven Street and let the house forget what was behind it. And it offers, as evidence, the one detail from that chamber that I still cannot explain and have stopped trying to. The inner wall was rendered on the far side, as I told you, finished, lived beside. The outer wall, the concealing one, was built with brick that does not match the house. I had a sample analysed. The composition and the firing profile are consistent with London stock brick of a later period than the surrounding structure. The best estimate the laboratory would give me was a range, and the range was the first quarter of the 1800s. Somebody sealed that room roughly 40 years after the last entry in the journal, which means that for 40 years somebody knew it was there and left it open, and then, at some particular moment, for some particular reason, decided that it should not be open anymore, and they oiled the hinge before they went. I want to say something about the cover story, because I think it is the most interesting idea in this entire theory, and because it is the part that has changed how I read every official explanation I encounter. When the bones were found in 1998, the press ran the story the way you would expect. Benjamin Franklin, body in the basement, founding father, mystery. It was a good week for headline writers, and then the archaeologists did their work carefully and produced an explanation that was accurate, well evidenced, and profoundly deflating. Anatomy school, William Hewson, ordinary practice for the period. Nothing to see here. That explanation is almost certainly true. I have said so twice already, and I will say so again. But notice what a true explanation does. It closes the question. Once the public has an answer that fits, and the answer is dull, nobody asks a second question. The story leaves the news cycle. The file is marked resolved, and every subsequent oddity that turns up in that building gets measured against the answer that already exists, and if it fits, it is absorbed, and if it does not fit, it is set aside as anomalous and left for someone else. The conspiracy's claim is not that the anatomy school explanation is a lie. Its claim is far more uncomfortable than that. It says the anatomy school was real, and the bones in the front basement were exactly what the report says they were, and the explanation was allowed to stand precisely because it was true, and because a true explanation is the most effective concealment ever devised. You do not need to fabricate a cover story if the building is already full of a perfectly good one. You only need to make sure that the true thing is discovered first, and that it is sufficient. I have thought about that a great deal. I think about it when I read official statements now. I think about it when a report closes a question cleanly, and I feel that small relief of a loose end being tied, and I have learned to notice that relief, because relief is when I stop looking. The most effective way to hide something is not to bury it under a lie. It is to bury it under a fact. There was one more thing in that room, and I have been putting off telling you about it. The rear left corner, where the second worn path ended, was not a wall. It was a collapse. At some point, probably long ago, a section of the vault at the back of the chamber had come down, and the rubble had settled, and the settled rubble had looked, in lamplight, on a cold night, exactly like a wall. The engineers cleared it in early March. It took 4 days, and it produced a space perhaps 2 meters deep, an alcove, and in that alcove was the apparatus. I do not have a good word for it. It is an array, a frame of oak, roughly 2.5 meters across, supporting concentric rings of copper coil, hundreds of turns. The wire is hand-drawn, which you can see under magnification from the irregularity of the gauge, and the insulation is silk, wound by hand, and I have tried to estimate the labour involved in producing that much insulated wire in the 1700s, and the number I keep arriving at is measured in months. The rings surround a low wooden platform. There are leads running from the array, 4 of them. They are heavy, and they are shielded, and shielding is not something an 18th century experimenter would ordinarily bother with, because there was no ambient electrical noise to shield from, unless what you're trying to protect is not the apparatus from the room, unless it is the room from the apparatus. 3 of the leads terminate in clamps. The 4th runs across the floor, through a channel cut into the stone to the base of the chair, to the restraint at the chest, and bolted to the frame of the array at eye height is a brass plate. It is the only decorative element in the entire chamber. Someone paid to have it engraved properly by a professional, in a good hand. It carries 1 sentence. Memory requires a conductor. I have looked at that plate for a very long time. I have photographs of it on my phone that I open more often than I should, because a plate like that is not a note to oneself. You do not commission engraved brass for a private reminder. A plate like that is a statement of purpose fixed to the front of an instrument, in a room where people gathered so that everyone entering would see it and understand what they had come to do. It is a motto. It is the kind of thing an organisation puts on its equipment, and it answers, in 4 words, the question I had been circling for months, which was why they went to such lengths to reach the nervous system rather than simply passing current through the body. They did not believe the signal travelled through space. They believed it required a path, a physical medium, something to run along, the way a current runs along a wire, the way lightning runs down a rod into the ground. And they had built an apparatus with 4 leads, 3 for the subject, and 1 running across the floor into the chair, into the chest of whoever was sitting in it. They were not only reading, they had built a receiver, and the receiver was a person. On the 11th of March, electricians came down to install permanent lighting in the chamber ahead of a formal survey. I was there. I had no reason to be there. I told myself I was supervising. They ran a temporary supply from the consumer unit in the corridor, and they were working near the alcove because that was where the last fitting was going, and at some point in the afternoon one of them set a cable reel down on the floor beside the array. I want to be extremely clear about what happened next, because I have gone over it perhaps 1,000 times, and I have an explanation for every part of it. A coil of insulated copper wire sitting in the changing magnetic field of a live cable will develop a current. That is induction. It is how transformers work. It is how the charger for your phone works. It is not mysterious, and it is not rare, and if you put an old coil next to a modern electrical supply, you should expect exactly this. The array made a sound, not a spark, a hum, low and steady, and it came up through the stone floor rather than out of the air, and I felt it in the bones of my feet before I heard it. One of the electricians swore and kicked the reel away, and the hum stopped. That was the whole event. Perhaps 4 seconds. Entirely explicable. Everybody laughed the way people laugh in old buildings. I had a recorder running. I always have a recorder running. It is a professional habit. In archives you dictate rather than write, because writing is slow and your hands are occupied, and after 20 years I do not think about it any more than I think about breathing. I listened to that afternoon's audio 3 days later at home transcribing notes. The hum is on the recording. It sounds exactly like what it was, a 50 Hz induction hum, and it lasts 3.5 seconds, and underneath it, in the last second, there is something else. I am not going to tell you it is a voice. I have had it analysed. I paid for it myself. The analyst was given no context and asked one question, which was whether the audio contained any signal of vocal origin. Her report says the following: that there is a modulated component at low amplitude, that its formant structure is not inconsistent with human speech, that the recording quality is far too poor for any determination to be made. That mains hum frequently produces artifacts that the human auditory system will interpret as speech, because the human auditory system will interpret almost anything as speech, and that in her professional judgment no conclusion of any kind can responsibly be drawn. That is the correct answer. That is the answer I would have given. I have listened to it several hundred times. The first 50 times I heard nothing but hum. And then, the way it always happens, the way it happens with every piece of ambiguous audio anyone has ever obsessed over, I heard something, and once I had heard it I could not unhear it, and now it is the only thing on the recording. 3 syllables, down and low and worn out, coming up through a stone floor in a room where somebody 240 years ago wrote in a margin that they had not considered that it might answer. Seal it again. That is what I hear. I am aware of exactly what that means about me. I know that I am a man who spent 4 months alone in an archive reading a dead person's handwriting and then heard a request in a mains hum. I know that pareidolia is the most reliable phenomenon in the entire study of perception. I know that the analyst is right, and that the recording is worthless, and that I would tell any student of mine to throw it away. I have not thrown it away. And I have never gone back down those stairs. I submitted my report in June. It was 91 pages. It was, I think, the most careful document I have ever produced. I described the chamber, the construction sequence, the dating of both walls, the furniture, the instruments, the 28 skulls, the engraved marks, the dental modification, the laboratory findings, the 4 notebooks, the letter beneath the flagstone, and the array. I made no claims. I want that on the record. I offered the ordinary explanation for every single element, and I offered it first, and I only noted the places where the ordinary explanation was strained. And I ended with a recommendation that the material be transferred to an institution with the resources to study it properly. I heard nothing for 6 weeks. Then the museum published a short statement. It said that recent structural works at Benjamin Franklin House had identified a previously unrecorded void within the basement fabric, that the void had been assessed, that it was consistent with a filled service or storage space of the type commonly encountered in buildings of this date, and that it had been recorded and stabilised. That is the whole statement. 94 words. I have counted them. There is no mention of a chamber or a chair or an inventory of human remains, or a letter in a lead-lined box, or 200 kilograms of hand-wound copper coil. My name does not appear in it. I wrote to the trustees. I received a courteous reply thanking me for my contribution, and explaining that the matter was under review, and that further comment would be inappropriate at this stage. I wrote again in September. I did not receive a reply. In October I went to Craven Street as a member of the public, and bought a ticket and took the tour with 11 other people, and it was excellent, and the actress playing Polly Hewson was very good indeed. At the end I asked, in the way a curious visitor asks, whether it was true that there had been more work in the basement recently. The guide said yes, there had been some structural repairs. She said it very naturally. I am confident she believed it. I am not going to tell you that I was silenced. Nobody threatened me. Nobody visited my office at night. What happened to me is the thing that actually happens, which is much quieter and much more effective. A committee decided that a finding was too anomalous to announce and too expensive to investigate, and so it was recorded and stabilised and set aside for someone else at some later date, when there is funding. That is how nearly everything is buried, not by conspiracy, by deferral. I had almost made my peace with it. In January, a package arrived at my department. No return address. Posted in central London, second class, in a padded envelope of the kind sold in every corner shop in the country. Inside was a single sheet of paper in a plastic sleeve. It is a page from a notebook. The paper stock, the ruling, and the binding damage along one edge match the volumes from the chamber exactly. The cut along the left margin is clean and was made with a blade. It is one of the 4 missing pages from demonstration 21. The body of the page is a technical record, timings, the behaviour of the needle, 3 columns of figures that I have not yet been able to interpret and that I have shown to 2 physicists, both of whom asked me questions I could not answer about how the data was gathered. Across the top, in the same hurried hand that signed itself A, in ink that has faded to the colour of weak tea, is a line that was written after the entry, because it sits above the ruling and crowds against the edge. It says, Craven Street was only the first laboratory, and beneath the columns of figures in the bottom margin there is a list. Paris, Edinburgh, Philadelphia, Vienna, 4 cities, each written on its own line, each one struck through with a single ruled stroke of the same ink, except the last. I have spent 7 months trying to work out what the strokes mean, whether crossed out means closed, or means completed, or means something I have not thought of, and I have spent 7 months looking at the one city on that list that nobody drew a line through, and knowing that in that city there is a building, and that somewhere in that building there is very probably a wall that does not appear on any plan. I am not going to go and look. I want to be honest with you about why, because I think you deserve better than a heroic ending. It is not because I am frightened of what I would find. Most of me does not believe there is anything to find. Most of me believes exactly what the report says, which is that an anatomist ran a school in a basement, and that the rest of it is a very old, very elaborate, very patient hoax constructed by somebody with more time and imagination than I have. It is because of one line in a letter under a flagstone, written by a man who was, by every account of everyone who ever met him, one of the most curious human beings who has ever lived. A man who flew a kite into a thunderstorm. A man who joked about being pickled in wine so that he could wake up in a better century. That man wrote, "Seal the room." If Benjamin Franklin looked at something and decided it was better not known, I am not sure I want to be the person who disagrees with him. So here is where we leave it. The house is still there. It is open most days. You can walk through the rooms where Benjamin Franklin lived for 18 years, and stand at the window he stood at, and look down a narrow street toward a river that has been moved and embanked and built over so many times that he would not recognise the view. The bones are real. That is not in dispute by anyone. More than 1,200 fragments, at least 15 people, in a pit beneath a windowless room, and the explanation for them is almost certainly an anatomy school run by a gifted young surgeon who died at 34 from a cut on his finger. History remembers the remains beneath Benjamin Franklin's home as the residue of anatomy lessons. According to the conspiracy, they were the last surviving traces of an experiment so dangerous that even the Age of Enlightenment, which was afraid of almost nothing, chose to bury it beneath its own foundations. I do not know which of those is true. I know that there is a room under a house in central London with a chair in it, and that somebody kept the hinges oiled, and that the wear in the flagstones runs from the door to the middle of the floor and stops. And I know that whatever else that path means, it means that people went in, over and over, for years. Sleep well tonight.